Hi, this is Damien Marie AtHope, and I'm an Axiological Atheist, which can be simply understood as a value theory or a value science atheist. So for me, it really starts in value. It's about care, and I have a guest today that I'm really excited to show you and share with you all. And could you go ahead and tell us who you are and what you do?
Thanks. I'm Norlyn Dimmitt. I'm the co-founder with my wife of Compassionate Citizens Foundation, and our primary mission is to economically and politically empower the American citizens to transform our broken economic and political system.
Wonderful. Could you go ahead and tell us what how they can get a hold of that, just real quick?
Sure. Anybody can go out to a website called CompassionateCitizens.us. It's .us, not .org. We couldn't get the org. Compassionate Citizens, all one word, .us, will tell you the story, our mission, and the bigger picture.
Wonderful. So could you give us some of the highlights or the goals that your organization is searching for?
Sure. In 2006, one of the leaders of the environmental movement, an individual named Paul Hawken, wrote a book called Blessed Unrest, where almost half the book was a huge appendix outlining over 2 million what we call silos of compassion, largely every nonprofit, every 501c3 in the world looking to do good in the world, operating inside of an organizational structure and not doing a whole lot generally in terms of collaborating with other people, so that ultimately there's this incredible inefficiency in the silos of compassion that are out there to actually address the suffering in the world. So he basically called for a movement of uniting all of those silos of compassion, which included the economic, the political or democratic, and the cultural silos. And we're looking to take seriously that idea that if we can bring all of us together under, no matter what our cause, no matter whether we care about carbon taxes or equal pay for women or Black Lives Mattering also, I should add, because all lives matter, and any issue you could imagine, economic equality or inequality. Basically, if you're doing it from a position of compassion, and if you wear our what we'll call a bumper sticker, #CompassionateCitizens, you have opportunities to get support from all of the other people that are in this shared community. Because if the community is the people that want a world that works for all, I'm going to argue that there's 76% of Americans that want to be part of this community once they find out about it. Whether you're a left-winger, a right-winger, or an independent, Republican, Democrat, or independent, you basically, an overwhelming majority of people want a world that works for everybody. They want peace. They want a compassionate culture. They want a democracy that works. And they want an economy that works for everyone.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm totally on board with that. I really believe in democracy. I really believe in empowering people. And like you said, Black Lives Matter. I totally support all that. I support feminism, Black Lives Matter. I also support the trans movement. And I support in general, removing all barriers that remove our kindness and remove our compassion. And I do really dig the thing of all of us working together. In fact, one of my mottos is we rise by helping each other. So when I found out about your goals and stuff, I was like, this guy's on the same page, pretty much that I am.
Yeah, good to hear. And well, the one difference that between what we're doing and what the vast majority of progressive organizations are doing, progressives overwhelmingly tend to define a world of inclusion that excludes people that they label as excluders. It's the idea of not tolerating intolerance, but we can contest the idea of intolerance. And I'll give you a specific example, because I was raised in a very fundamentalist religion. There are a lot of people out there I grew up with in rural Georgia who voted for Donald Trump, who I'm not particularly a fan of, but I have friends that are fans of Donald Trump, and very few of them are invited into conversations with my progressive friends because they are deemed to be unworthy in a sense of being in that conversation because they don't pass muster on their what they defined as inclusive. And very specifically, we can even talk about LGBTQ because that's an area of contention along with the pro-life, pro-choice debate that doesn't involve, it's not quite as heated as the pro-life, pro-choice, but it does involve declaring LGBTQ to be sinful and therefore something that they should be, not promoting. To me, if you're going to define that as being intolerant in general and you're not invited to the conversation, you're excluding a very big tens of millions of Americans and therefore setting up a situation where we're pitting one another against one another rather than finding common ground. So I think the place to find that common ground is to not get into, first of all, the debate over the morality of LGBTQ, but to come together as understanding that you differ in that debate, but that there are a whole host of issues that involve 16,000 children a day dying in third world countries for lack of basic sustenance. And I know darn well the vast majority of us agree is not a good thing. We can't even address that issue if we can't come together in respectful dialogue.
Well, yeah, I'm an anarchist, socialist, mutualist, collectivist. But to me, I talk with all kinds of people because I really care about, those are all to me labels in a sense. The only reason I use them is just so some people understand where I'm coming from. But I really want to touch people's heart. I really want universal betterment. I really want human flourishing, the whole planet as much as possible, everyone as much as possible. And, I think that the most important thing really is to have open dialogue. And so I always try to talk to people. And even some people that are rude to me sometimes, I still try to talk, civil with them because my goal of the being out in the public in general, I'm sure like you, is to actually make a difference. I want to make a positive difference. I'm not trying to come out and just promote myself or to just be angry at the things in the world. I want to make positive change. And that's why I really appreciate, some of the goals that you have. And I want to hear more about, which things you think can change and, what things you think, are possibilities. So could you head and
sure, yeah. By the way, well, number one, yeah. Let me just address the 5 planks of our social mission, and anybody that's following along can go out to compassionatecitizens.us and look at these, because we tried to make them very simple in terms of appealing to the general audience, but there's a much, much deeper literature around every one of these except the first one. And the first one is the one that we can all instantly come together on, and that's relieving suffering in the world. There's no Southern Baptist I've ever met, and I grew up in that world, no United Methodist from the rural South that I've ever met that thought it was okay for a child under 5 to die for lack of basic sustenance, even if that child was a Muslim, even if that child was an atheist, even if that child was destined to be LGBTQ, let's say, via DNA, which is a whole extra set of issues we don't have to get into at all, is the argument about nature, nurture in being homosexual. But in any event, the fact that we can come together around that unleashing or relieving suffering is reason to come together. It's plenty of reason. A fundamentalist who thinks that an LGBTQ member is in fact sinning against God can sling hash for the homeless with that person and feel good about that. And so it makes no sense to say let's not associate ourselves. Even the most fundamentalist Christian says love the sinner, hate the sin as their official, however well they practice that, we might debate, but their official posture is to love the sinner even in their sin and pray for their salvation, of course. So if we can give credence to that as an intentionality, as something that is the core conviction they have, whether or not they live it out fully, we have a reason to bring them into that conversation. So the relieving suffering is that first plank, and it's the one that the vast majority of us supports, probably 98%. Anybody that's not a psychopath supports that. And then it's when we get into these other 4 that we start talking about ways to achieve that, to actually maximize the well-being of the worst off. Number 2 is leveraging unleashing our gifts, is I think the way we put it, And that is to say that instead of focusing on our weaknesses, because we're all very different, if we would focus on the strengths that each of us has, the different personalities, the different orientations, the ones of us that trip over ourselves because we can't pay attention to details are also the ones of us that can often see the furthest as to what's possible. And if we bring ourselves and our talents together collectively, we're not only collectively wise, but we're collectively effective. That's the whole basis of the Industrial Revolution and division of labor in the corporate world that's created this economic system, which is hardly all bad. There's a lot less suffering per capita in the world today than there was 200 years ago, but it can be improved dramatically. But this idea of unleashing gifts is an idea that if you look at the asset-based community development movement, and that's ABCD as the initials for easy remembering, asset-based community development is bringing people together in respectful dialogue at a local level and finding out that that guy that just came back from prison that was an ex-convict also was the best sales guy in the community. He was better at dealing heroin than anybody. He got more clients than anybody. And if you can find a way to legally patch that talent set into an economic machine, you've got a way for that person to be a positive contributing member. Right now in the inner city, there are very few opportunities for ex-convicts that get out, go back to their distressed, impoverished communities, and they have no place to plug that in. Guess what? They end up back in prison because they use their skill in an illegal way on account of not having a choice. And there's all sorts of evidence that if you gave them a choice, if you put impact investment into that community, if you created an urban permaculture, organic farm from, basically the urban towers, they talk about I forget what it's called, urban agriculture, basically.
No, I like that stuff.
But that's a way to empower and to solve the food desert problem and to actually uplift people. And that's a movement that's happening increasingly. And we'll get to that in plank number 5. But the third plank, to move on a little bit, second plank is basically to collaborate individually in a community by getting to know one another across your partisan differences, across your theological differences, with the common purpose of strengthening the civil society, but also leading to economic and political empowerment. Number 3, and the first 3, by the way, they're all cultural in nature in a sense. Number 3 is taking that idea of collaboration at the organizational level and saying, there's a whole movement. If you Google Collective Impact Forum, that's a joint venture between the Aspen Institute and an organization called FSG.org. In 2011, a couple of people wrote a paper about the potential for deep collaboration between these organizational entities so that they operate in the same way that individuals within an organization operate on a division labor model. You're taking the core competencies of these different organizations and allowing the ones that do things better than everybody else to focus on that with the complementing skills and talents and core competencies of the other organizations. Right. You have this idea of collective impact. Austin coming together is an example of a very poor neighborhood in Chicago, right next to Oak Park, which is a fairly wealthy neighborhood, frankly a very wealthy neighborhood. But a lot of the people in Oak Park are involved in this collective impact that involves over 50 organizations coming together in something called Austin Coming Together, aptly titled. That's starting to happen all over the country now. There's a whole movement associated, and they're starting to work with the asset-based community development people increasingly, because you can't separate the individuals from the organizations. You've got to look at a community as a holistic entity. So the first 3 planks are essentially about how do you build empowered communities where you're unleashing the gifts of every citizen in that community. And then we get on to the actual big-time changes, which is the economic and the political system. I have argued for over 20 years that, and by the way, let me pause for 2 seconds. Did you have any questions or comments about the cultural side of this equation at the community development level?
Well, I had a lot of stuff. I want you to go ahead and say all of it first, and then we'll go through them.
Then we'll go back. Okay.
Yeah, because I want people to. The reason why is I want everyone listening to know what they're what you stand for. Then we'll go through the stuff and we'll talk more about it.
Well, number 4 is what I've devoted the last 20 years of my life as an unpaid evangelist. There is a movement that's called the Deliberative Democracy movement that right now has roughly 30,000 people that are seriously associated with it in some way, shape, or form. That is, activists, academicians, practitioners, facilitators, conflict resolution specialists that are working in some part of this field about bringing us together so that there's an opportunity to unleash collective wisdom, but with a specific goal ultimately of politically empowering that collective wisdom. The idea of deliberative democracy, very briefly, I'll give a 2-minute history. The idea of deliberative democracy was formulated by a guy named Ned Crosby in 1973, going on 45 years ago, and it was basically taking a random sample of citizens. He called it a citizens' jury, just like the jury system, where a random sample of citizens comes together to arbitrate something, to where the vast majority of citizens don't have to get down into the weeds, but they know they've got somebody that represents their demographic category. 51% female as an example, the right proportion of African Americans, Latinas, given the constituency that you're in, would come together across all the socio-demographic characteristics there so that nobody is particularly left out. If you've got a community, if you're the only Native American, you might be left out, or you might not, because you might have gotten randomly selected. But the idea is to take that group and to give it real political power by having candidates that pledge to be accountable to, not to adhere to. That would be direct democracy. That would not be our constitutional republic, but to be held accountable to the collective wisdom of all of the citizens. Very briefly, to back up to our two-party system, which is anything but democratic, we're the only advanced nation on the planet that has a two-party system where we put ourselves in two polarized positions that it turns out leave 76% of Americans without a party. 76% of Americans support democracy, real democracy, over our broken two-party system. And right now they just have no place to even play. They end up picking the lesser evil, and you hear that comment more often than not. Every time we have an election, I'm just voting for the lesser evil, because neither party represents that particular voter the way they'd like to be represented, which is issue by issue by issue, democracy counts. We shouldn't have a country where 90% of us support universal background checks and the NRA can subvert the will of the people, overwhelming will of the people, mind you, because we've got politicians more accountable to money and their donors than they are the people. So 76% of Americans support that idea. So this idea, the number 4 plank is empowering a wiser democracy. We may even explicitly mention educating citizens about democracy. We are 501c3. We cannot do politics, but we are in fact allowed to educate citizens, as, by the way, any 501c3 is. Most of them choose not to because they're afraid of the IRS clamping down on them. They need to be educated that they can educate citizens about the possibility of their empowerment. So that's my life work. Out of the 5 planks, that's the one I'm focused on the most ideologically, if you will. The 5th plank is the results of empowering a wiser democracy. The vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of citizens in the world, want a world where people count and where the planet counts, where the future sustainable planet to be able to support future generations is taken care of. The vast majority of us. And that's what we call a triple bottom line economy. People, planet, and profits. We're not denying profits. We're not even denying free markets. But allow those free markets to incorporate the actual values. You talk axiological. The values we actually have put people in front of profits. The ones we carry around, the ones we practice, are mired in a consumerism that says your net worth or your worth is your net worth. And if your worth is your net worth, you want to accumulate as much money, it becomes a win-lose proposition. Your generosity, your compassion is constrained by your desire to be held in esteem, if you will, by your neighbors who also pursue the mighty dollar. And in point of fact, most of us in this country are self-described followers of Christ. 70% of us now, it's down from a much higher number in past decades, but 70% of us claim to follow Jesus, who would find our consumerism reprehensible, morally speaking. So there's this big incongruity between what we actually value and what we practice, because we have a culture that has put everything on what the conservative evangelists and the progressives would say is the almighty dollar. So that's an area where the triple bottom line economy is the thing that we as citizens would demand that for example, we would demand that a company not be allowed to exist that would close down and destroy a town to get cheaper labor to increase the profits a little for the shareholders. The vast majority of us find that morally abominable. And yet that happens again and again. Bain Capital being the one that Mitt Romney, everybody remembers from the election, that destroyed a whole town so they could make a few more dollars by outsourcing to cheap labor. That's not taking care of people.
No.
Now, there's a whole more complicated issue about globalization, and there's a million debates. Every one of those planks, especially 2, 3, 4, and 5, there are multiple books. In the case of Deliberative Democracy, thousands of books written. In the case of Triple Bottom Line Economy, thousands of books written about that. But the vast majority of citizens are completely unaware of either one of those movements. And what we're doing is saying everybody that supports Triple Bottom Line, a caring economy, when you ask them, they almost overwhelmingly support deliberative democracy as well. Why are we not bringing ourselves together under a single banner that we're calling #compassionate citizens? Because compassion is the core value that every civilized citizen of this earth embraces officially. I have never yet met in all of my discussions with people over 57 years anybody who says compassion is not an important piece of gluing civilization together. So that's enough to pause there and give an overview, but all this stuff goes way deeper than anything we put out there. There are hubs around each of these planks. There's hubs that have multiple. In the case of neweconomy.net, let me mention that one for the triple bottom line economy. There's over 200 organizations associated with that. In the case of Bridge Alliance, there's over 80 organizations associated with this deliberative democracy movement. BridgeAlliance.us is the website for that. Neweconomy.net is the website for the movement for a triple bottom line economy. And there are a host of other silos that aren't even yet a part of that actually support the mission. We're trying to give a reason for all of them to come together.
And I totally agree. That's why I wanted to have you on, and I appreciate what you do. And when I, found out about what you're doing, because like I said, to me, we have got to. We are one planet. I mean, we're one. We can't get outside of that. There's not like a planet 2, or we have got to work together. And to me, in general, I feel like that. No one, in a sense, owns the earth. I mean, it's not, you can't own dirt. I mean, you can say that you own the land, draw borders. You can say that, you have a thing to take care of where you're at. But to me, truly, the issue about when I talk about value is seeing the value in people, seeing what are people. To me, I see people as fellow dignity beings. And I see dignity as the ability to experience, wonder and to experience pain. So I see animals too. I think that we need to be, as you said, compassion. I think that in general, the more compassion I can bring to the world, and is what my goal is. Because I know that to me, I see it as two main things that, in a sense, a dignity being wants. This animals and humans is safety and comfort. Because just think, if you have comfort, like let's say wealth, but you'd say you're a drug dealer, you have wealth, tons of wealth, but no safety, constantly fearing your death, got to live in bunkers, practically, and they can't go out in the public, can't even do normal things without worrying about being armed. So to have comfort but no safety, that does not work. That's not flourishing. You cannot flourish under that kind of thing. And if you have the same thing, if you have, safety but no comfort, if you're somehow locked in a box that's sterile and you don't have anything that benefits you, the person withers. They don't flourish. Society, humanity, our goals, our things, like you said, that working together, they can't flourish if we do this. So to me, it's a balance. The same thing I think that, like you were saying, even though I am very far left, I have no problem talking to people, even sometimes on the far, right, if they can be civil, because I really believe that we do have, like you said, I mean, I don't think they want their kids to go to school and be shot. I don't think, they want to find their child overdosed on drugs and dead or something. I mean, I think these are things that, in a sense, to me, I agree with you that most of us, unless we're insane, something's like really dramatically wrong with us, I think that we would want at least a well-being for ourselves and our children. And to me, once you see that, in a sense, everyone has that same goal or has children, like you're saying, I don't see how we can ethically truly look at others and go, yeah, I don't wish them to also be well.
Right, and officially, and the nice thing about, let me reorient, even knowing that you're an atheist and I'm not, I'm just to make clear to the audience, I'm officially in the minority Christian wing of the Unitarian Universalist Church. And that is to say that Unitarianism rejects Trinitarianism, says Jesus is not co-equal with God. Essentially, Jesus was a profound mystic, and incarnation you could even use as a metaphor for religious people. I realize that goes over like a lead balloon with atheists, but I'm also a universalist in rejecting the idea of eternal hell, that a loving and all-loving God that can love more than we would never stick our own children in eternal hell. There's a biblical justification, by the way, a deep justification for both Unitarianism and Universalism. My birth year, 1961, the Unitarian Church merged with the Universalist Church. They became what we call UU, Unitarian Universalism, but it went increasingly in the direction, right now probably 2/3 of Unitarian Universalists are atheists like yourself, but they are committed not as agreeing in opinion, but as seekers after truth and justice is more or less their mantra. They have no dogmas whatsoever. They have no creeds whatsoever. You could be a what they call a Buddhitarian, a Buddhist, go in there. Obviously, you could be an atheist and go there. Most of them are. You could be anything. You could theoretically be a Southern Baptist, but you'd run into little trouble on the LGBTQ welcoming, because they are a welcoming congregation. But you would be accepted by what I would consider an enlightened Unitarian if you ended up thinking that was a sin, but otherwise you believed in universal human dignity and you genuinely believed in loving the sinner. Because the issue we have here in the hypocrisy is not loving the sinner. Even if you do think it's a sin, I can debate that with you, I can fuss at you, but I don't have to tell you don't have the right to believe what it is that you believe. That to me is not very tolerant of me, even though I find you to be, in a sense, exclusive or excluding. I have to be able to get in a place where I recognize that you take Deuteronomy seriously. You take that Old Testament, which is the part of the Bible that beats up on LGBTQ, mostly,
or children or women.
What's that?
I said, yeah, or children or women. I mean, certainly the Old Testament can be used to abuse your children, abuse your wife. I mean, abuse your employees.
And so the debate over whether my life work is to end the subjugation of women by men and to equalize women politically and economically. So in that sense, I am absolutely a devout feminist. I part ways with a feminist in terms of, again, when you go too far and you say that somebody who believes that life begins at conception, however much we want to throw about hypocrisy and not caring after they get born, rather than do the distraction there, let's deal with the actual case. There is an argument. There's an atheist argument to be made for preserving life at conception. We have a conflicting of rights between the right of the mother and reproductive health and the rights, and at what point do those rights get conferred, which we all have a different opinion on, perhaps. I'm not going to address the resolution of that. My own personal views don't even matter much in terms of setting the stage. What we can say is that there is a way to have a respectful dialogue between pro-lifers, and a pro-life person that walks into the Unitarian Church and gets excluded or rejected and says you can't be here because you're pro-life. That is intolerant on the part of the Unitarian Universalist, and I would call my own church out for that kind of exclusion, because there is, in fact, an argument to be made for life beginning at conception. You have no point at which you can say there isn't an uninterrupted series of events to where there is no, it's a very arbitrary thing to say, oh, here's where it begins, because the 2 seconds prior to that, what's your argument then? So you get this whole, and I don't want to get into that debate. That's a debate to be had. I tend to try to stay away from all debates because my purpose is to change the process by which we arbitrate debates. And so that's the stage, and where my focus is, and our focus is actually interfaith dialogue, which is very inclusive of the American Humanist Association. It's very inclusive of atheists, agnostics, because Otherwise, we're just being hypocrites about saying that all voices matter. You can't have an inclusive, diverse orientation and say except for. Anytime you do except for these people who believe that, you've actually been exclusive unless the people are believing something hateful. And I do believe that if you're a Muslim who thinks it's okay to drown your disobedient daughter, that view is absolutely unacceptable, and we cannot abide you having that view. But here is the difference of transpartisanship. I also have to allow you in that conversation to debate everything except that. You don't get to debate that issue. No, we will put you in prison. We objectively, democratically, and constitutionally find that heinous, find that to be human rights abuses. You don't get to do that, but you do get to be in the conversation to talk about pro-life, pro-choice, to talk about every other issue that divides us, and most progressives would say, no, I don't want to give voice to that person.
Well, yeah, I'm not pro-life in the sense that, to me, until the fetus is able to experience pain, I don't think that the moral weight of the fetus's life at that point is over that of the mother's rights. But I do think,
and that's a good point.
I always tell people that my position is axiologically on the value. So to me, once the dignity being can experience pain, it becomes a dignity being. Before it can experience pain, to me, it is not a dignity being. So the clarification, it is a life, or the potential for a life, but the point is, to me, it's not yet a dignity being, including animals. Animals that can feel pain. There are a few bugs that don't feel pain. That does not mean that in a sense, they may feel something, but they don't feel in a sense of pain receptors. Some insects. But that doesn't mean I even think that they should be harmed. We really should not be harming anything. But I'm saying is there is a difference to me that a dignity being is a thing that can experience pain, thing that has an awareness of self. So to me, the more the awareness of self, the more there's a higher level of responsibility. But to me, the issue is that when we focus on what the thing is, then we could assess its correct value. And then to me, we have to understand, though, to me, when I say value, I'm not just saying the thing in itself, because I see value at least in 3 categories. And almost everything. There's a lot of different ones, variations and layers of that, but 3 main ones. There's intrinsic value, thing unto itself. Then there is extrinsic value, what the thing in a sense does in the immediacy that its action. Then there's systemic, how a thing happens through time, or as it develops. And so to me, there's values in all 3 of those. Like say this conversation. It can have all 3. It can have an intrinsic value that you and me in a sense are benefiting from it, regardless of what anyone else watching. Okay? Then there could also be that what we're doing, this action of any action that's positive like this, putting positive stuff out, talking about democracy, giving people, avenues to not feel hopeless and helpless and disconnected, that is an extrinsic value that's going to be happening as soon as I post this. But then there's going to be a systemic. There's a systemic value too. This video is going to be seen for, let's say, next 5 years. I have one video that has almost 900,000 views. So, but it didn't happen overnight. It's taken now 3 years for it to get that. So systemically, at first it looked like nobody cared, but then systemically you keep seeing it. It's still, so I think that what we're talking about is something that is very systemic, and the fact that you and me are not just talking about something that you and me are benefiting from. You're not even just talking about what we would like to do in this next election. We're talking about how we're trying to change everything. And that's what I really care about. And so I wanted to back through the things and then talk with you more in depth. And also, when I want you to mention each one. Give me like the motivation. What is the why? Why is it? And then so in a sense, I want to know, why is it? What do you think it's going to do? So why is it? Like the motivation, the philosophy, whatever you want to call it. And then what do you think that is going to happen by you doing it? And then we'll talk about it.
Right, sure. Yeah, and I will address real quickly just because I want to hammer the point, because pro-life, pro-choice, we can agree, is probably the single most divisive issue in the culture wars, and it's in fact the issue ever since Roe v. Wade got put in place by the Supreme Court in 1973. It's been the issue that has rallied the current conservative movement. I think everybody would agree with that, whether you're on the left or the right. You could say that's the rallying call. So this issue of arbitrating, what you said, the position you take, I've heard people talk about when the brainstem forms. I've heard people say when there is a live personality and so forth. There are different places to draw the boundary that is obviously all of them after the moment of conception, which is a very, very specific place to draw that line. I have heard progressives argue right up until the moment of birth, that's inside the womb, you have the right, which most Americans and most people in the world would consider that murder at that point. So even though there's no place to draw an exact line, the pain threshold is a place, but there's no proof that that's exactly where you ought to. You ultimately leave that to the subjective judgments of individuals after being informed, I think, and then you let democracy ultimately dictate something as important. I get castigated by my own church because I said that was, of all the issues in the world that we should have allowed democracy to arbitrate, pro-life, pro-choice that we're so deeply divided on is one of those where we should have allowed it to arbitrate, because by not allowing it to arbitrate, what we did was that we diminished the value of democracy, and we did it in the worst possible way. We took the people that are the most passionate about pro-life, beginning at conception specifically, and we motivated them to aggregate no matter what else. So the people in Kansas vote against their own economic interests because pro-life is their only issue. For them, it's a moral issue. And if we can't understand that if they disagree with you and me, and you and we don't agree exactly on that, but let's say that we're not far off. But anybody that disagrees vehemently on either side of that spectrum, to say that your belief about that doesn't matter, it's being imposed by the Supreme Court, that you don't even have, even if the majority of your community believes that, there's something diminishing about that in terms of the political fabric. There's something diminishing in terms of the efficacy of that community, and it creates a real rage against the federal government, which includes that judicial branch. And I'm speaking as somebody that was raised by a misogynist father who was a racist, who was extremely fundamentalist in his theological upbringing, all of which I utterly rejected. But the fact of saying that his opinion doesn't count, that the one vote, one person doesn't count, to me, it was not the best way to go. And even I believe that one of the Supreme Court justices, Ginsburg, has said that in recent years. But again, I didn't want to arbitrate that. What I wanted to say was that getting back to my emphasis on democracy is that ultimately we have to come together and arbitrate these deeply divisive issues, regardless of how emphatically we may believe that our specific viewpoint is the correct one. If we don't allow for the fact that other people legitimately disagree with, by legitimate I mean you're not going to persuade them to change their mind. That's their axiological core in any kind of short run. They may change their mind because of a near-death experience, but we need to be much more forgiving, understanding of one another as having different values on these things. So that it's not a matter of saying we center it on values. I'd argue every American, every global citizen agrees that values is the real anchor for everything. It's because we disagree about the values.
Some people don't realize that. It's profoundly amazing to me. I'm like, well, first of all,
they don't act like it. They don't act like it. They all feel like it. If you ever ask them, and this has been all the studies that have been done on deliberative democracy, everybody rises to the occasion in the context of defending their worldview to say that people matter. Their official posture is that people matter and that the future of the planet matters, unless you're one into premillennial dispensationalism and think the rapture's coming and there's no reason to bother yourself with the future of the planet. I don't know what to do for that category, but I also believe firmly that that category of people also get a vote in our democracy, because anything short of giving every person a vote in this society is a form of violence against them. It's a form of political oppression against them.
And speaking of that point, I really feel like that we should allow prisoners to vote. I find it personally, to me, the fact that now if they do their time and they're a model citizen, I think now if they're on parole and they're not a model citizen and they go in and out of jail and they don't desire to be productive, then I could maybe understand if you say that. But in general, I think that if you take a person and you demoralize them, then you bring them out and you continue to demoralize them, I don't know how we expect that that's going to produce a positive outcome.
Right. Well, not only, and that's another issue, and that's not nearly as divisive, by the way, but let's go there, because this idea of democracy in and of itself is an incredibly boring topic, and as Winston Churchill
I love the
said,
topic, so bring it on. I love democracy.
It's to the average person that we're trying to reach out to, we're trying to market this movement to. I will tell you, they care far less about democracy than the possibility of an economy that works for all. It's just that you can't get to an economy that works for all without democracy. So democracy is the why of democracy is because it empowers us to make decisions. Let's talk about what you just said, because it's a very important topic, and it's one over which there is significant. It's not to the level of universal background checks for guns, but it's probably 80% of Americans, once they're informed about this, would agree with you completely that by giving, and I would even take exception with the guy that's not the model citizen, because
I
draw the line anywhere with respect to democracy.
No, I wasn't saying I agree with that. I wasn't saying I agree with that. Yeah. I was saying if someone were to try to bring that argument, I would listen to it. I'm not saying that I would agree with it, right, but I don't agree with saying that if someone serves their time and they are a good citizen, why can't they vote? That's what I won't agree with. I won't even hear an argument.
I think not letting people vote actually increases, as you kind of alluded to there, it increases the likelihood of you then not being. If you're disempowered in any aspect of yourself, if you are diminished in any aspect of yourself in a permanent, scarred way, that says you are no longer considered a full American citizen, then you are essentially, by being degraded, that creates the conditions of the very violence that you are trying to deal with in the incarceration system. And what I want to make a point of is that the vast majority of people in the independent, libertarian, non-theological side of the political spectrum would agree with you on that point. And so, again, getting back to what democracy gives us, that problem gets solved by democracy. The problem of mass incarceration, the problem of locking people up for smoking pot, absolutely goes away when we end up empowering a wiser democracy. We could talk about all sorts of things with respect to this being basically a way to deal with the civil rights movement, if you were a racist, was to say, let's create a farm system for reimposing slavery via a private for-profit farm system for abusing and exploiting labor, and let's make sure that we disproportionately lock up people of color. And if you look at the evidence, that's exactly what we did. So this is the kind of stuff that really would alienate. I didn't mean to go down some of these roads, because a lot of the people that I want to invite into this conversation are people that would be turned off by the narrative that I just put out there, because they've got a different narrative that thinks that those private prison farms are perfectly legitimate.
Well, this is why I always think about everything. So if a private industry could do it, I'm not pro-government if it isn't necessary. But see, the problem is, are you telling me it's doing a better job? Is it more ethical, prison system? Is it producing a better outcome and that our society is safer with? If you could tell me that the private prison system produced a safer environment, it helped, it was better for the inmates, and it was in a sense cost saving for the state, I would be like all for it, but it's not. And it's none of those. Like I'm saying, it's not. It's not compassionate. It's more horrific. It's more actually less caring. It's less responsible, less ethical to me. From what I've seen, I'm not saying that I'm 100%, so I don't want to ever state facts I don't know. I'm not saying I know everything about the for-profit prison system, but from what I've seen and heard and some of the things, It is absolutely none of those things. Because that's all I'm trying to say is that I'm not saying that things have to be government. In fact, like I said, I'm fine if everything is all grounds movement, but it has to be beneficial. If it's not, then I don't have to think about all the other, is it government, is it not?
Right. So that gets to an interesting point there. So, and we'll stay on the axiological side since that's your claim to fame anyway. So your audience is probably very much geared to saying, how do we arbitrate our issues in respect to some firm axiological foundations? I'd say values. Axiology, of course, includes the whole aesthetic world as well, which is by the way, we don't have this as one of our planks, but there's an entire movement that I think permeates all of our planks, because marketing all 5 of these as intersecting planks of a compassionate world is so important. There's a field called transformational media. I just invite all of the listeners, however many those happen to be, to go and Google the term, in quotes, transformational media. There's a whole movement around marketing these ideas, because what you're doing in a sense is transformational media, but it's in the non-fictional variety. But I'm talking about even movies and everything that we do, the novels that have a didactic purpose, that have a awakening us to our full humanity, that gets us to understand some of these complex issues. But this idea, the general idea, we may disagree on what it means to maximize the well-being of the worst off, but the vast majority of us agree with the idea of maximizing the well-being of the worst off, if we qualify that by saying as long as that worst off is fully human, let's say, or fully deserving of universal human dignity, and because I want to at least allow that somebody that believes that we shouldn't, in the death penalty, let's get to that, because that's a whole issue that divides left and right in a lot of ways. The death penalty says if you're a certain level of bad seed, that we're not going to any longer confer human dignity on you. Now, I think you can't draw that line, and therefore I'm opposed to the death penalty.
For everyone listening that probably knows my thing, but people who don't, who have been listening, I'm against the death penalty. My thing has to do with, I only, in a sense, feel that ethical violence occurs to me as a thing that's happened because of a ethical use of self-defense or other defense. And this means that, to me, I think that any act of violence has to be a defense, or it starts to lose its ethicalness.
Well, but just to go there for 2 seconds, for somebody that's arguing for the death penalty, that's from the right and doing it in an extremely rational and a deep level, and let me back up a second. There is a whole group of people that I would not disinvite from the conversation that believe that the human species is fundamentally flawed so badly. The transhumanist movement is about replacing our entire species. Now, that seems like the ultimate death sentence, right, on our entire species, because it's not conducive to the flourishing of life generally. Now, having had that as an argument, and there's a strong argument for that when you look at what our DNA leads us to, even the most so-called educated.
But I was just going to say, I don't know what you're talking about transhumanism the way you're saying it, because I've heard about transhumanism, at least from what I've heard, in a sense, or that maybe you're using this term different, or maybe you're saying something different. I don't know. But transhumanism, to me, at least as far as I've had a couple of friends, that what they see is that humans cannot, in a sense, keep existing without evolving. And what I've been told, and I don't say I fully understand it, but they're saying that we need to integrate more technology into our lives. Instead of, like, some people say that we need to, cut off the TV, and cut off the YouTube or whatever. Theirs would be the exact opposite. That is how we can get to flourishing, is when we stop limiting ourselves to our own little self. Like you're in Illinois. We're not limiting ourselves. I'm sharing this you're sharing this with the world. So, in a sense, how I've been explaining, the transhumanist is also trying to find genetics and stuff like that to help us evolve better. But so
right. Well, and by the way, I did not mean I didn't mean an extermination of given human beings while they're here. I definitely meant the re-engineering of our DNA.
Okay.
So the point of, you think about arguments about singularities and everything else, but the idea that we have to make it illegal to continue to propagate ourselves as we are with all the propensity towards hate. If you think about Freudian psychoanalysis and his theory, his thanatos, his death instinct, if that's wired into us, now this is speaking to only the progressive people who believe in, or people who believe in evolution, but if our DNA, if we were evolved, as I certainly believe, from the reptilian ancestors that were pure eat or be eaten, if we've got a violent impulse that's always having to be kind of trained out of us at the expense of years and years of civilizing efforts, and we could engineer the hate out of our DNA and engineer the compassion and empathy into our DNA, if there's at least, I'm just saying, an argument for that. Now, that argument in a democratic context has to reach critical mass, i.e. the median voter, the 51st percentile voter, before you're going to do anything with that. And it's one of those where reaching 51 may not be enough, because there's people that are so vehemently opposed to, there's people on the left opposed to GMO. Well, GMO is nothing more than genetically modifying agriculture so that it feeds more people. It's not intrinsically evil. It's
I agree with you.
Potential abuse and untesting and everything else that you can make an argument. The left gets hung up over an absolutism with respect to genetically modified agriculture, which to me is silly.
I agree.
But that's my vote.
Well, I agree, and I'm a leftist, but I don't even when I say anarchist, I have my own kind of theories in that I'm my own theorist, because once again I'm even in anarchism in a sense. I'm axiologist first. I really care about the value. I'm really trying to assess what's the value, what's the most ethical thing for me to do, what's the most ethical thinking, what's the most ethical behavior, how do I produce the most ethical thinking in others, how do I produce the most ethical behavior in others, and how do I, sense for me, change the world to be more ethical and to behave more ethical. That's.
But on that, so you get all sorts of issues, and you talked about Jainism earlier before we started taping, but Jainists who put a net over their mouth to keep from swallowing mosquitoes, you could take an ethical argument based on your relative valuation. Humanism, for example, is a value, centers value on the human species in particular, so definitely elevates in general, humanists elevate the human species over a mosquito. The Jains don't. They talk about life as being intrinsically valuable, and yet those mosquitoes that cause massive millions and millions of people every year, to die from malaria, from yellow fever, from whatever. There's a utilitarian argument that says that no, killing the mosquitoes wipes out a few bird species, but it saves 1 million lives. Where you draw those lines is going to be different. I always come back to the fact of saying I'm not trying to arbitrate where that line gets drawn, but I'm saying the people that have the right to make that argument have to be the people properly informed of what the pluses and minuses are, because
I agree with that.
But even that, democracy itself has a tremendously strong moral argument to be made against it. And that is to say, if you've got a spectrum of people at various levels of, and let's use the term spiritual in a very broad way, of spirituality being your First,
can you explain what you mean by that word? To me, it doesn't have any meaning.
I'm a big fan of Abraham Maslow, so let's reference Abraham Maslow, because a lot of people have heard of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. That is something that is faith independent. You can be a profoundly spiritual, self-proclaimed Christian or a profound atheist.
Right, so can you explain what that word spiritual means to you? It doesn't mean anything to me.
I'm going to mention Maslow so I can talk about spirituality from that standpoint. If you're an atheist and you do not believe in profound mystical spiritual experiences, and that, let's go even further, because that to me would be every atheist that looks at the work that's going on in the transpersonal psychology movement. If you Google Integral Institute in quotes, if you Google Ken Wilber in quotes, and the work he's been doing since 1978, following up on Abraham Maslow, there is a study of spirituality that has to do with deep meditating Buddhist monks who may in fact be atheists in the way we think about atheism, who have profound experiences, conscious experiences that are not common and not part of the fabric of normal human beings, and it causes them to be. There's a causal relation. It causes them to act in a way that's far more compassionate in the world. So let's just look at let's assume there's nothing that we could call God in the universe, that there are experiences that make us more compassionate, and let's identify spirituality as the degree to which we have an enlarged circle of care. If we care about the 16,000 children dying mostly in sub-Saharan Africa today, yesterday they died, tomorrow they'll die, roughly speaking, 16,000 people a day.
So you said another word though that I can use, and I don't even need spiritual. In other words, I'm just saying I'm fine with care. I'm fine with experience, because I believe, to me, I see us that in general, I see us that we live in our phenomenology. In other words, we live in this perception, because that's where we allow ourselves to stay. When people like have the clouded glasses, well, the reason that is because we really don't perceive reality straightforward. We get it like an assessment our brain is taking. That's why we can fall for, say, optical illusions. The same thing happens to me mentally. We're constantly living in this kind of mental illusion because we're not paying attention to all details at all time, in all ways, in all reality. In other words, I don't notice there's a picture behind your head. Half the time I'm looking at your eyes. So because I'm actually paying attention. I'm not assessing all the other information. You didn't probably notice there's a picture behind me or something either. I mean, but because you start to focus on the person, we're connecting, on a real level. And when you do that, your mind starts editing and doing so what happens is, we think we have like 100% awareness of everything all the time. And so to me, that creates a problem. So because we're not doing that in real reality, we're constantly almost in this like soup of emotions and things that how we're perceiving stuff. And then we're
right. Well, let me deal with spirituality in relation to exactly that. So, and I use the term spirituality very deliberately, knowing that I have to really qualify it for any of my atheist audiences. I get along far better with an atheist than I get along with a fundamentalist Southern Baptist. I mean, make that real clear. So at the same time, I do know how to talk to a Southern Baptist in a way that I very sincerely, I consider myself a follower of Jesus, something you would never say. As a Christian, even though the vast majority of Southern Baptists would say I've got it sufficiently wrong that I'm going to burn in eternal hell for having it wrong, but then I come back with, well, that's too bad because I don't believe in your hell. I'm a universalist, so I'm not sure where we go with that. But at any rate, this idea of spirituality to me, because if you are a believer in following Christ and you have had something called a conversion experience, and these experiences actually happen, the phenomenological, let's use your term there, the phenomenological experience that they translate and they interpret as being something of connecting with God, that they now put a male label on called God He, that they perhaps have genitalia associated with, which,
I always think it's funny.
Well, but because our propensity is, we start getting into the roots of epistemology, which obviously you can't separate from axiology either, because you still have to say what's the frame that you're dealing with. Well, your thing about focusing, and I'm going all over here a little bit, so I'm trying to bring it down to a focus. But this thing about the fact that we all cut out 99.9% of what's actually in our conscious experience in order to drill down and focus for the most part on the one thing is precisely why we cannot make an intelligent and a wise decision as regards tweaking the systems that govern us, whether they're political or economic, by ourselves. Because the blinders that we effectively have on by our own desire to focus on one thing causes us to not focus on something else. It matters if we actually live our lives in a consumerist mindset, when in fact we know compassion is the thing we claim undergirds our deepest spiritual, and I use that term in the sense of axiological, but I want to use spiritual whenever possible, because my biggest audience and your biggest audience ultimately, in terms of building a society that works for all, happens to be made of people, 85% of whom do not declare themselves to be atheists. I don't know what you think the latest number is, but roughly speaking, 15%, I think, give or take a few percent, of American eligible voters would declare themselves to have no spiritual orientation. Another 10% would say spiritual but not religious, and probably only 5% are spiritual and non-Christian. So we actually have this weird phenomenon where the vast majority of us we are in a sense a Christian nation. We're a Christian nation that ranges from people supporting Bernie Sanders to people supporting neo-fascism.
Well, I like to say it more like a line that we're a nation of Christians, because a Christian nation would mean that you guys, in a sense, or Christians own theocratically own a country, and if that's what someone thinks, then we definitely have issues.
Right. What we need to do is to honor, and this is where the left and the right cannot even have a conversation, because what I want to say to my friends on the left and the right is I want to say, look, it's an empirical reality that 70% of us claim to follow Jesus. Now, what does that mean politically in the context of democracy? It means that our median voter is a woman. 51% of us are women, therefore the 51st percentile is a woman. The median voter is a woman. The median voter, from a plurality standpoint, because you have to look at white as one color among many, we are still, from a plurality standpoint, we're the largest single ethnographic group, right? White Caucasian. It is a white woman who claims to follow Jesus Christ. That's just an empirical reality. Yeah. And if we can't deal with that empirical reality, we don't even have anything to talk about with respect to democracy. What we have to do is say, well, what does that white woman who claims to follow Christ actually think about the incarceration system, think about pro-life, pro-choice, women's reproductive rights, birth? And that's where we end up with all sorts of very interesting things. We end up with somebody that supports universal health care, that supports equal pay for women, that supports a carbon tax, amount to be determined. Let me not try to tackle the amount, but a carbon tax as being the most economically logical way to deal with reorienting the supply dynamics that involve the need to shift to renewable energies, and a whole host of other things that the progressives claim as their causes. And what they don't recognize is that real, empowered, wiser democracy not only gets them to that cause, but gets them a wiser public policy in respect to the answer to that cause. Issues of affirmative action that tear us apart, issues of abortion rights that tear us apart, all of these issues that tear us apart because we don't come together. It turns out that the different focus that we have on those issues, from the far right to the far left, turn out to be more collectively wise. And it's not magical, it's just the fact that we have every viewpoint represented, and we have the blinders removed in some sense and to some degree across the board, and that's what matters. It doesn't matter that we don't convert the super fundamentalists on either side, and the progressives have lots of fundamentalists that just think this is the way it has to be. Single payer, universal. There are other ways to get to universal health care than single payer. For us to immediately say that's the only answer stops the conversation cold, and we can't bring in the rest of the relevant facts.
Well, yeah, I always tell people that to me, I want all positive change. That's why I say I'm a liberal, progressive, revolutionary. Because all that to me, in a sense, if you're talking, like, once again, like, axiological is what matters to me. If you're talking about trying to make change in the world, then to me, you're on my side. And if you're not, then I see that as what's against me, in a sense. Or against all of us.
Here, let's go to, let me wear the hat of a conservative evangelical for a little bit, because I think it'll get at some important points. Because I was immersed in that world, I was raised in that world, I utterly rejected the theology of that world, the values, I rejected the misogyny, the patriarchy, anything you could imagine, the idea of eternal hell, the idea of a Trinitarian theology that makes everybody else go to that eternal hell if you don't believe properly that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, that you're going to eternal hell. All that stuff I find, frankly, just unacceptable theologically. I passionately disbelieve those things. But the people that believe in those things and that believe that it's of sin against God, that it's an abomination to live a lifestyle that we would call LGBTQ, for example, have to be brought into and given one person, one vote in this deliberative democracy that we're talking about.
I agree. I believe in direct democracy. I believe that we should cut out as much as possible anything that impedes that. I'm not saying we have to force it, but I mean, I'm just saying that I'm saying that we should be, our goal should be free, fair, everyone involved.
But that gets back to this issue of democracy versus the philosopher king at the extreme, right? The benevolent, wise philosopher king that Plato talks about, which I'm guessing he would have always assumed as well would have been a male, just by the way, just because it was a patriarchal culture in those days as well.
Yep.
In terms of, and it was, so the point being is that we're not, democracy itself, in sort of the Occupy idea, right? The idea of eliminating all hierarchies, which is very central to the idea of anarchy in general would be the idea of eliminating hierarchies. But there is a tension. Let's just acknowledge the tension, and we never did get to finish the idea of a spiritual evolutionary track, where some people are in fact, in some measurable metric, wiser than other people. I don't think you would disagree with me. Some people have more wisdom than others.
Well, yeah, I agree with some people have more wisdom. I just don't agree that the word spiritual encompasses that term, which more wisdom. But I want to give me a little S on this spiritual then, so that it allows for us. The Parliament of the World Religions, parliamentofreligions.org. Anybody can go out and look that up. It's been around since 1893 when it convened. All the religions of the world convened in Chicago to try to get to peace past all the theological differences. The humanists were represented. The secular, the atheists were represented in that, because it was absolutely not about, when you have interfaith dialogue, you're in a sense setting aside any of your particular beliefs that are at odds with everybody else for the purpose of coming together in a united front. I agree. That's why we're talking, and I debate people on the street with Christianity, and I rip into people, when they say things that I don't agree with. But I have not, and I don't have any desire in this video, really, in a sense, to debate any Christian thinking you have, because I want to talk about the politics. I want to talk about a better world, and so I agree with you. There has to be, and in general, I think there has to be more important than just ideas. We have to live in the here and now.
Right.
We have to live together.
Take the implications of allowing the conservative evangelical to vote, because let's get back to that. Because in an ideal world, yes, everybody votes. But what if you've got somebody that you and I can agree that the idea of a male God and patriarchy and the implicit misogyny that all inevitably falls from that, and the idea of hierarchy in general, where you got the ultimate hierarchy of God and you have to submit to God's will.
I agree.
It detracts from the ability to build a world that works for all. At the same time that we're going to say, I have to be able to not only invite that person in, but I need them to support my democracy movement. It's just a factual case that if I don't have the 70% that support the Citizen Cabinet initiative, we're not going to get to the Citizen Cabinet. We're not going to get to empowering a deliberative democracy. But there is a little bit of a tension there, because you're creating in a theoretical world, what you want is to have the wise conservatives and the wise progressives come together so that the decision from them, we want that Citizen Cabinet to be comprised of a hierarchy of wiser people within each of those camps, so that we don't have to fiddle with the unwisdom of the masses.
Yeah, but hold on a second though. But I don't think that allowing people rights is in a sense an unwisdom, because that's like saying to me that education should only be for those that could actually utilize it. Because it says no college.
Bear with me.
So there was let me make a point though. Let me finish. So that's like if I said that free college should happen only for those that we can genetically assume could use it most effectively. The giving free college to people that are not going to be, in a sense, a benefit society is, in a sense, a waste. But that's only if the goal is actually that they produce something. I find education to be something society produces for the benefit of the people. I see it as the exact opposite. Instead of citizens having to benefit society, I want society to benefit citizens. Now, I agree with you. That means we have to be involved. We have to start, promoting. But so I agree. We need everybody involved. And I agree. And to me, in general, it's not. I can't even debate. Can a conservative vote? Of course they should. I'm totally for free, and they could be. I'm the most against them, and anyone who becomes more fascist. So the more fascist you are, the more I oppose you. Like Donald Trump, can't stand him. On many levels, but it's the more the fascist stuff that is the most. And the sexism, homophobia, and racism, and all their stuff is all of it's bad. But I'm just saying, it's the fact that he's going to push the racism. He promotes the sexism. It's all that toxic. He worships totalitarian governments. He praises people that get murdered.
Again, let's get back to the supporter of Trump, not Trump. Let's leave Trump out of this because, and not that you can leave him out. He's actually out there ruining the world in our view, right?
Yes.
But the fact is that and I'm going to address this to anybody that happen to be watching that are on the conservative evangelical side, frankly, because it is so important. A lot of the people, I have very good friends that I disagree with vehemently that are avid supporters of Donald Trump. And because virtually all of my classmates from rural Georgia, Harris County, Georgia, one of them may be watching this, who knows, if it gets posted to a Facebook page or something.
It will.
Because they are devout, fundamentalist-oriented, conservative evangelicals who supported Trump because he was the darling of the conservative evangelicals. However irrational you may think or incongruous with reality you and I may think that is there.
Well, yeah, I just don't understand how you can say you believe in Jesus and support Donald Trump. I mean...
Well, let's not distract from the core argument here. The argument is empowering a democracy that is comprised equally, disbanding a two-party system that automatically excludes the voices of either side. Right now, we're the ones excluded, and there's the tension between the rights that we're all after. If you and I are after a world where the maximum, the mutual maximum thriving of the least off, the worst off,
that's what I want.
Jesus himself said. For my Christian friends, Jesus says, how you treat the least of these is, in fact, what it is to be Christian. Jesus says, love your enemy. Jesus says the number one commandment, love God and love your neighbor. And how do you love God? How you love your neighbor. And specifically, how you love the least of these. So when John Rawls talks about 580 pages.
Go ahead. And I was going to say, make sure that you explain it because don't assume that everyone knows. I know what you're talking about, the veil of ignorance stuff. But
John Rawls goes through 580 pages of analytical philosophy to derive a conclusion that says nobody behind a veil of ignorance. If you don't know where you're going to show up on this world, you would never vote for a system where you could be left out in the cold, where you could be left not able to thrive, not able to feed yourself, starving before the age of 5, or dying from medical issues. You would never vote that for yourself, even if it was a 1 in 100 chance that you were going to be in that pool, and therefore you would create a world that ultimately, when you look at all the statistics and the utility curves and everything else, bringing economics to bear, bringing philosophy to bear, he basically comes up with this conclusion that says we would all vote for a world and a world order and an economics and a politics that maximized the well-being of the worst off. Now, that comes straight out of, he was very much a fan of and influenced by Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. He was not a utilitarian. He bent like a Jeremy Bentham utilitarian, says maximize the general total added up happiness. But if that leaves as a sacrificial lamb somebody else, that's not okay. He says maximizing the well-being of the worst off is the highest order goal that we can all aspire to. And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of us, if we allow for differences as to salvageable humans, the death penalty example I was telling you, if you think a Ted Bundy, you say this is a flawed human that's past the boundaries of what we can call a decent enough human, it's okay to go ahead and not tap the resources we have. We'd rather feed a hungry kid than to keep him alive. There is an argument for that. You and I may disagree with that, but there is an argument for it that we have to accept it's not an entirely illegitimate argument that we don't have enough to feed everybody, so we have to pick and choose who's going to get fed here. The whole lifeboat ethics idea here. Now, you and I can both argue there's plenty of resource. The problem is we haven't distributed it correctly.
Well, that would be my thinking is that...
Of course. Let's not go down some of these rabbit holes because there's 1,000 rabbit holes.
Well, and I was going to say too, we don't produce food right now for human flourishing. We produce it for corporations. to make money. I mean, it's
as a profit maximizing.
That's right. It's not for to feed people. It's to make money. I'm not saying that there's wrong to make money, but I think that I'm just saying the reason it doesn't work to flourish people is it never was designed for that purpose. The market is not designed for that.
When I left graduate school without a PhD in economics, I am a fellow in the Society of Actuaries, one of the most elite mathematical professions on the planet, just for the audience. That's not to be braggadocious. That's just to say I'm a math geek. I'm a super math geek. I created a blueprint that created 500 million in this old capitalist model for the owners of Zurich Direct. In 95, I left the capitalist world for good. I left the regular consumerist profit-maximizing world for good. I never again set foot inside that. By the way, I have to apologize. I did for 6 months. For 6 months at Allstate, I was a senior manager participating in unbridled capitalism because I had not gotten investment for my stuff. But philosophically, I left it.
And I just want to say, even though I'm anti-capitalist, I wanted to say that I don't feel like the worker that's under the burden of having to eat is doing something wrong with being involved in the capitalist system, because we, in a sense, can't get outside of it. So I don't like shaming people that say have to work at Allstate. What I would say is that what are you doing to help change the world?
Right, but there is an alternative model. So you can, in fact, say, as a matter of course, that you're going to be willing to work for a lot less, because the average American complaining about insecurity, paying their rent, makes 10 times more than is necessary to thrive. 10 times, fully 10 times more than is necessary to thrive. Now, they don't thrive because they live in a capitalist world where to thrive is defined in their mind as a single-family home on a quarter acre that's absolutely wasting perfectly arable land and sucking up resources to keep a green lawn that's doing no good for anybody, putting toxins into the ground while we're keeping that lawn green. It's so vast backwards from any kind of a sane, civilized, sustainable world, the very way that we organize ourselves. But the average American can't change the zoning laws, can't change by themselves, but they can in the context of
right. But speaking of zoning laws, there's areas in the country I've lived in California, in areas where most of the time in my life I've lived in apartments. I've never owned a house in my entire life. But what I was going to say is, though, most of the homes have like what do they call those? I can't remember now, but what they call it. But it's like a commission that controls what all the houses do. So they'll say you have to water the lawn. In fact, they'll write you up and you have to pay fine.
Well, exactly. No. But that all gets back to because the politics involved here at the local level, which is where it really has to begin ultimately. But you have to be cognizant of the fact that you have a representative in the U.S. House of Representatives, for example. It's comparatively local, representing 750,000 or so citizens, supposedly. Got to be aware of your citizenship role. We're trying to educate citizens so they understand that that's on them. It's on them if they have a condominium association that's bullshit. That's pardon my French there. That says that we're going to do things that's harming the planet overall. It's on them to be engaged in that, to be civically engaged. But right now they don't see themselves as having power. You can't blame them for their sense of learned helplessness and learned hopelessness about changing a system.
No, I don't. I don't blame them. I want to help them.
Our goal is to say there is a blueprint for this that does not require evolving ourselves, changing our current theological orientation, shifting gears, and this gets back to my conservative evangelical buddies. So my conservative evangelical friend, and she knows who she is, but if she happens to ever watch this, who loves Donald Trump because of all the political capitalistic ideology stuff, not because of this narcissistic personality disorder, which she would concede he has. She's bought completely hook, line, and sinker into the consumerist ethos. She has not embraced a triple bottom line ethos. She says to me, I do care about suffering, Norlyn, and I don't mind doing some good if I can do it. By the way, if I can do it without compromising what's in my bank account. So she has sort of an Ayn Rand objectivist virtue of selfishness orienting principle that also says, I wish there weren't so much suffering in the world. So even the worst case Ayn Rand objectivist has compassion, and that compassion has a place to play out in a real empowered democracy. I've had decades-long conversations with Ayn Rand objectivists. I tend to have very good dialogues with Ayn Rand objectivists because they're oriented oriented to logic, and I'm extremely oriented to logic. Emotion is something that drives us. Emotion supposedly undergirds our values. They're not one and the same, as you know, but the fact is that when we have our deepest values, we have these deep, passionate emotions that can, in fact, be supportive of those values. We can put our emotions in the service of our passions and our rationality, so that it basically, instead of buying into this thing that we know in our deepest heart of hearts is broken, we can say we have the capacity, and here's a path that will take us to a different world without me having to change. And here's the thing I want to say about that. I do believe in human transformation. I do believe in spiritual development. I'm going to use that term because there's not a better term you could say in a more axiological development, but I have nothing to say to my conservative Christian friend now, and you just alienated a guy I need to have inside that circle, or a gal I need to have inside that circle. That guy who follows Jesus, that gal who follows Jesus from a particular set of substitution, eternal hell, God died, Jesus died through God. I didn't hear you on that. Am I losing you on?
Yeah, you cut out for a second.
Oh, okay. It was a little glitch there. I have to be able to have a theory of human nature and human society that fully embraces the individual who will go to their grave believing Jesus Christ died on the cross for their sins, so that they, and all who believe John 3:16 in the way that they believe in it, shall not perish but have eternal life, and all others are going to burn in eternal hell. There are tens of millions of American citizens, the ones that pulled out in
right, but
great
to me that there's, I agree with secularism. I know, but to me, I agree with secularism. So I feel you said that there should be. I feel like that's secularism. That we should, be. I think we should support the religious freedom and then my freedom to not be religious.
Exactly, but the point being is that when we're getting into the actual issues, this is what I want to get to, is that what democracy means, what deliberative democracy means in the context of what actually emerges from that in real public policy. Because I hope you would agree with me, is if it were possible to wave a wand and determine that there was benevolence and great wisdom, that Plato's probably not wrong, right? If you had the possibility of conjuring up a single individual who had the capacity to not put the blinders on and see everything else.
I would not. Well, to me, I think that there's a flaw thinking that we can't govern ourselves. I'm not saying that doesn't mean that we can't have people that are leaders. Of course, I agree with leaders. I don't think that means that we can't have community organizers that are. But personally, I'm an anarchist. I do not agree with a person telling other people. I think that we should, you talk about democracy. We should. So to me, I'm not 100% against, in a sense, somebody trying to make governance. I'm for governance. I'm for the organization of the utility to human betterment. So I don't know.
Right.
I just don't think that...
You're missing my point entirely here, because I'm not arguing for that at all. I'm not arguing for it at all. I spent the last 20 years of my life evangelizing deliberative democracy. So let's agree that I'm absolutely wanting to politically empower a guy who I don't think is that wise, I don't think is that spiritually developed, I don't think is that compassionate, and you can go down a list of all sorts of attributes, and I'm saying, and by the way, I want that person to wield power over what our actual public policy is. There's an incongruity there in saying I want to empower the guy that's not as wise as what we could definitely imagine having in terms of governance. I'm simply saying, as a thought experiment, the extreme is the benevolent.
You're talking about like the John Rawls veil of ignorance, then, is what you're talking about.
Let me talk about my own movement and where this tension exists.
Like I said, I'm all for hearing about. That's why I wanted to go through your points, because I dig a lot of the stuff you say. In fact, I feel like we're like 90, something %, connected. We're on the same page.
Correct. And I agree with that 100%. But here's the thing I want to say that may surprise you. I'm 90% in agreement with what the conservative evangelical follower of Jesus who believes in substitutionary atonement and eternal hell, I'm also 90% in alignment with where they are. The 10% that I would consider theological BS gets in the way of some stuff, actually thwarts the idea of equal rights for the LGBTQ community, thwarts the reproductive rights of women, does some things that I vehemently disagree with at a personal level, at the same time that I cannot but confer on them the same political equality to take their deepest held values and to have one person, one vote. And if it were a different outcome, I might not be I'll be very frank with you, I don't believe in democracy in any kind of a deep axiological way. I believe that democracy is the most stable of all possible systems of a true democracy because it gives the greatest purchase to the fact of people feeling political equality, given that nobody wants to be lorded over. Here's the problem with that. Nobody wants to be lorded over, but especially in the testosterone half of the gender divide there, the vast majority of us have some reptilian impulse to lord it over. There is a power hunger that exists in us at a DNA level.
Hey, I think that's actually, a very interesting point. But to me, I think that we need to definitely have everybody involved, but it's just because we can't do otherwise. Like I always tell people, they always get shocked. I say I'm 100% for direct democracy. I love democracy. I also hate it. I think democracy is one of the most abominable ideas that you could have, as you were saying before. I like to think I'm a pretty bright guy, right? And I think that it would be great, as you said, if only bright people were the ones voting. Because, as you said, look at how many things, as far as not what we believe as far as after this life or stuff like that, but the fact of how we should operate in this life. That's where you and me are the same. How we should be treating other people. So to me, I think that if all those people were voting, man, the world would be wonderful. Now I know that, of course, we're not, in a sense, the ones that care, compassionate, and caring and want human flourishing. Right? We're not the only ones voting. There are some who absolutely are completely selfish or ones that actually want the world to destroy. And are hoping for that. This
gets back to the point, though, of saying, and we never did quite finish up this idea of spiritual development, the idea of Maslow's hierarchy. Maslow was he was a humanist, he was a secular Jew, but he recognized, as did William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience in the late 1800s, I think, or early 1900s, he recognized that there were genuine, powerful, profound experiences that people had, like I had in the mental hospital in 1980 when I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I was put on lithium and thorazine, and I had what I call my Timothy Leary moment. Timothy Leary being a guy in the 60s, for those that don't know, who advocated LSD. At the time, this was the countercultural revolution. He was a Harvard professor, and he saw LSD as a way to open up the brain to spiritual experience. And in fact, there are a lot of people that had profound spiritual experiences in addition to the bad trips and the other things that happened before it got outlawed in October of 1966, and all of our good psychedelic music dried up after Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Jefferson Airplane. That's another whole trip for people, but essentially this idea that of having a profound spiritual experience, he recognized that was real. And in his hierarchy, if you look at his hierarchy in the deepest form...
Well, so hold on a second. So when you say real, once again, just for anyone listening in my audience, what I would say is the phenomenology is real. I do believe that people have emotional experiences.
That's all we can say anyway. That's all we can say of any experience. We can't absolutely prove that this isn't all somebody else's dream. You just can't. You cannot prove anything. So everything is from our conscious experience. There is no proof at the level of foundationalism. There's only coherentism. There's two different debates in epistemology about where you anchor truth. There is zero absolute truth that can be proven.
And that itself is a truth. But so you're already having an issue because that's a truth. let me just finish real quick. So for anyone listening, how I, as an axiologist and an atheist, foundationalized truth is, I assess that feelings are occurring. That's an actuating event. Once the event happens, then thoughts start to occur naturally, just as a human, as an aware entity. This is just, you don't have to try to have thoughts. This is just something that happens. So it's a natural origination in a sense. So thoughts occur. When thoughts are then organized, because that's what a higher thinking animal does, organizes thoughts. When thoughts organize, I consider those to be axiologically, we're having a naive axiology. We're starting already to understand that some thoughts are different than other thoughts. So that's a naive axiology. You're doing a value judgment. Okay. So some thoughts are, when I try to say the world is built off what is useful. So the idea of a thought, we start to realize axiologically, some thoughts are more useful than other thoughts. That alone starts to allow us to understand what right thoughts are. Then right thoughts become reason. Right reason becomes logic. Right logic becomes mathematics. Right mathematics becomes physics. Right physics and then becomes all other science in a sense, to me. Just so other people sense, that is in a sense how, as an axiologist, a theorist, that I would say how we get to what is true. And what is true is what is useful. And in a sense, everything for me is built off of a pragmatics, normative use.
Right. So going back, William James and John Dewey and C.S. Peirce were the three primary thought leaders behind the whole philosophical school of American pragmatism, which had both an axiological ethical foundation and an epistemological, obviously, right? Which is for the theory of knowledge. For those, probably most of your audience knows the distinction of the terms there. But
go ahead and explain it for other people that don't, because there may be some listeners that don't. You're right. I probably have a more educated audience than some people. But could you go ahead and say it, because I like to not assume.
So epistemology being that there's three fields of philosophy. There's essentially axiology, which includes both aesthetic / art, say, and
ethics, morality, value,
or general moral values.
Yes.
But art itself is always intrinsically something we're considering useful. We wouldn't hang it on our walls.
Once again, use, exactly.
Aesthetic utility. So axiology is the whole theory of values generally. Epistemology is the whole branch that deals with how do we know, how do we come up with a science that ultimately is a science of, from your frame of reference, it's about mapping to utility, but there are a lot of abstract theoreticians that like the idea of the cosmos independent of its utility. So there's people that deal with quark theory and string theory and stuff that has in this generation or the next, reasonable applicability to changing how we operate in the world, but they get all consumed with Einstein's theory of relativity and mapping that to current string theory in physics. So
as axiologist, I still see that as use. Because once again, I don't see everything as only a flat value. I see intrinsic value to the thing, extrinsic in its immediate, in a sense, action, and then systemic. Now, what you're talking about is a systemic value. I don't think that has no value, and I would say...
Well, no. But let's just leave it at there are some things like the trip to Mars, spending a couple billion on a trip to Mars while 16,000 kids die. There might be some differences of opinion on whether or not we spend that money, because it's going to be very expensive, many billions of dollars to get to Mars.
Well, I would say axiologically is not a hard thing. If you were to say to an axiologist, what is more ethical, to take care of kids or to go to Mars? Well, that is an easy thing. But see, that's black and white thinking, because that's not the only thing or the only revenue source, or that's also assuming that science can't, in a sense, generate that money. Because in other words, I think that what we should do is actually, like what you're doing with the democracy and the compassion thing, I think, like, say, going to Mars. There's plenty of people that would fund that. And I think that we could do a community, or
yeah, absolutely. So I want to. This gets back to a really important point, because I'm a free market guy. I'm one of the few progressives you will ever run into that's a severe progressive, if you will. Wants a world that works for all. Wants maximum inclusion, and yet And I lost my train of thought there. So
you said you believe in the free market.
Because if I can't compel you. I'm not a Leninist. I'm not a Stalinist. I can't compel you to be compassionate.
Yeah, and I'm not either.
Compel you to give money, which gets into immediately this whole problem with democracy. Democracy at a fundamental level is telling an Ayn Rand objectivist that says I have no obligation to my community, either the local community or the global community, to care whether they live or die. And there are people that philosophically have that position, and we as a democracy are saying, tough, it's a free rider problem if we let you opt out. We have to collectively bind ourselves because we collectively consider starvation of 16,000 kids to be unacceptable, and the only way to eliminate it is to coerce. And we got to be honest about this, right? To coerce the guy who says, I don't have an obligation, to say, no, you do. Because the rules of civilization that are going to allow us to live out what we believe is the most valuable means we have to run roughshod over what we consider distorted sense of where the ethical boundaries are. And this is right.
Speaking of the ethical boundaries, so I believe in, you talk about William James a lot, so I believe in the guy that actually had a real problem with William James. And so to the guy that basically came up with the idea, he was a mathematician, and he came up with the idea of the ethics of belief. And I'm as an axiologist, that beliefs are very important. Beliefs, in a sense, lead to actions or inaction. Like say
they frame actions at the very least.
And so I really care about what we believe and what it produces. So once again, it's about use. It's about what you're going to do with that belief. And so I don't think that it means that we should not let people have beliefs. I think people own themselves. So even if I wanted the belief to be removed, people own themselves. I support that people own themselves. I don't own you. I don't have a right to tell you what to believe. Now, I do have a right to offer my ideas. I do have a right to, in a sense, try to, you said, persuade. Absolutely. It's almost, but what I want to do is persuade with care, because I know that care is a profound thing that we in this society seem to not realize. When you show someone care, when you show an honest, earnest desire to listen to them, even if they disagree with you, it allows for a ability for change, for growth, even for both people.
Right. But this whole idea of centering on compassion, so let's go right there, because that's the absolute crux. The name of our organization is CompassionateCitizens.us, for anybody that wants to go visit. And compassion is the center. We come out of, the first thing you'll read is that we are supporting an existing initiative that the Charter for Compassion, and go to them, charterforcompassion.org, all one word, charterforcompassion.org, is an initiative. They have a Compassionate Communities initiative. They have over 700 compassionate communities across the globe of people that have come together around the idea of co-creating a culture of compassion to replace the existing culture of consumerism. But that compassion, there's this entire universe, even that universe of culture of compassion movement, folks, believe it or not, are siloed off. There's another, if anybody gets a chance, go to my LinkedIn profile, by all means, invite me to connect. I get 30,000 connections. I'm only up to 7,400 and change, so I've got lots of room. But I wrote an article about NRA versus democracy, because the National Rifle Association is flagrantly saying we don't care about democracy itself. The reason I have hope for this country is an accident. It's an accident that 70% of us who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ also claim overwhelmingly to be supporters of democracy. Those two things are not consistent with one another in any kind of a meaningful way. Jesus never, ever, not once, did he ever utter the word democracy, much less say whether it was good or bad. To say that Jesus was a proponent of democracy is to misread Jesus. He didn't mention it. He was worried more about the kingdom of heaven on earth and submitting to God and whatever that meant to him than he was this idea of democracy. And in fact said, give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. That is a quote from Jesus. And that said, submit to the Roman
Empire.
Authority.
Also, there's a part in the Bible that says that the kings of the world or something like that, the kings that are under, or you're under, have been authority or chosen by God.
Well, that's a whole extra thing of the gods in the case of the Roman Empire, right? And so when Constantine accepts Christianity in 325 AD, convenes the Council of Nicaea, and then builds this warped patriarchal misogynist version of Christianity that is the main thought lines that lead to everything we've got today. Everything that you and I would disagree with theologically completely, whether we're inviting them to the Democratic table being beside the point here, but you and I would openly disagree with the concept of eternal hell, substitutionary atonement, and all this stuff that and especially the man as the head of the household, to where you are to obey your husband. The husband's never asked in the wedding ceremony to obey the wife. It's very much a one-directional, you obey the husband, and all that leads to in terms of building a patriarchal world. You and I can resist that completely. At the same time that what I'm saying is that we have to allow everybody that whatever their particular deepest held beliefs, to bring their beliefs as well as their everything else that they value into that dialogue and help us to determine, and they will get one person, one vote to determine public policy, at least to the level of holding our representatives accountable. In reference to your direct democracy, the fact is that conservatives do not believe in direct democracy in any way, shape, or form. They will not show up for that discussion, and there's a reason for that. There is a prioritizing of theocracy over democracy when it comes right down to it. They would prefer democracy because it gets them the ability to vote for theocracy. We see this play out in Egypt. We see it play out in the Middle East. And there is a whole category of people, that is what they would do. They are still invited into this citizen cabinet to help us determine policy, because we're going to turn the other cheek and we're going to actually give the one person, one vote political equality that they would rather in the end not give, because what they want to do in the end is to say, let's take our numbers, let's take our ability to show up and put people in power like Mike Pence, because it's Mike Pence that they were voting for. They were not voting for Donald Trump. It's very important to understand that Mike Pence as a candidate was the reflection of a theocratic impulse that they came out and voted for.
And in fact, speaking of which, everyone to know, I'm actually flying out to from Seattle to Indianapolis, because I want to protest Mike Pence's theocracy government. I don't care about his faith as far as he can believe what he wants. What I do not like is him wanting to shove Christianity down everyone's throat, or at least his version, because I don't even think that all Christians would agree with him. So he's certainly forcing his own limited version even of Christianity on everybody.
But I'm going to turn the tables on you in terms of how you move the mountain and how you get to the promised land, how you get to a triple bottom line economy. And I've been thinking about this now for over 20 years, so at a pretty deep level. The way to get to a triple bottom line economy, to empower a wiser democracy, is to go to Mike Pence and say to him, by the way, I absolutely think you should not have to leave your deepest held theological values at the door as you come into the political public square, and as you make the case for being basically discriminating against LGBTQ, and as you make the case for life begins at conception and we need to shut down all abortion clinics and the morning after pill, and as you make the case for all the things that I find particularly disconcerting, that you have every right to make sure that you have a place to make that case, because the narrative that brought those 63 million people out to pull the lever for Donald Trump was one where we had a war on Christmas itself. We had a war on Christianity, and you've heard this language, and if you watch Fox News, you see this narrative. I want to neutralize, pardon my French here, I want to neutralize the hell out of that bullshit narrative. Because the narrative that keeps the progressives from ever getting to the promised land is exactly the narrative that fuels the fire of those who see progressives, and especially atheists and the secular progressives, as being assaulters of freedom of religion. So we have
to... Right, and that's why I think it's really important for me to be in the public and push my caring firebrand atheism because of that. Because I am going to start a new narrative that people understand that what an anarchist really is a humanitarian, is a person who doesn't want oppression. I want people to understand what a real atheist, firebrand should be to me. It should be that we care about humanity, and that we're. So my biggest issue with religion is indoctrination. I do not believe that a person gets their, in a sense, religious freedom at 18, because that's what I hear society saying. Right. Society is saying that a child. They'll say religious freedom. You mean the parent's religious freedom, which can be possibly the child's religious oppression.
Well, and a point of fact is, and you and I both, and we talked about this earlier, we don't have to get into it, because of being raised in extremely fundamentalist,
I was raised in a cult,
misogynist and patriarchal society. We were, in fact, indoctrinated in a religion that was deeply oppressive in our view. And I only say in our view because I want to honor the fact that I don't exude truth that has to be writ large, because that takes away everybody else's freedom of having a web of belief.
But how I'm focusing on is religious freedom is not something you get at 18.
Well, no, I agree with that completely, of course. And I wrote a paper in grad school about the Amish not having the right to completely prevent their kids from understanding at an earlier age that there is a pluralist society. But if you stand inside their epistemological web of belief and values, and I look at those two things as two separate things, the idea of the empirical reality around how the world works, and the systems reality, if you will, and the values of what we should be aspiring to, what it means to be fully human, over which we disagree. As 7 billion people have 7 billion different theologies, if you include theology to simply mean one's axiological web of values and beliefs. You can't separate the two, because the beliefs constrain the values and vice versa.
The values give beliefs meaning, and then beliefs give values meaning, in a sense. So they kind of work. They go back and forth in a sense.
If you believe in original sin, if you're a conservative evangelical that believes that Jesus died for our sins, but that we still go to our graves as sinners, and that's why they can love the LGBTQ member as a sinner but hate the sin, and preach out, quote, Leviticus as being a sin, and not be complicitous in your gay marriage by spending artistic energy on your cake, which you could definitely make an argument as a libertarian. As a secularist, we shouldn't be compelling people to use their artistic abilities to support a value that they don't believe in. There is something I would
right. Well, as long as they don't want to sell it in the public. To me, once you engage in the public, you're under public ethics. Your personal ethics, because that's what you're talking about, the difference between personal ethics and public ethics. Your personal ethics would be maybe that. Well, let's just say a Nazi. Does a Nazi have a right to say no blacks, no gays, no Jews? I mean, can they do that?
No, and I don't think anybody's claiming that that's what they can do. So let's at least draw the line as to where they're drawing the ultimate line here. What they want to be able to do, what the vast majority of us will consent to, even in the conservative world, is that if you walk into my bakery and you want to buy, and you're openly gay, flamboyantly gay, and you want to pick up anything that's in my store, you have the right to do that. There's very little pushback on that, honestly. You hear the outliers, you see the outliers. The vast majority, even of conservative evangelicals, believe that if you're in the public good, you cannot discriminate against a gay officially. That's their official posture, because that's the official posture of the society. And don't forget, people care about love and belonging. They don't want to be seen as the outlier. So they agree with that. Here's what they disagree with. And we need to at least consider the reason and the passion behind. If I am going to do a special wedding cake where you're asking me to use my artistic, I would not ask you if you thought bestiality was a bad idea. Let's go there. Let's go. If you thought bestiality was a bad idea and you were one that decorated a cake, and I asked you to put a cake together that memorializes my attempted wedding to a donkey or whatever, and you said that is morally reprehensible to me and I'm not going to memorialize that and use my artistic expression, I should not have the right as the state to say, oh, but you must. And there's
but you're just saying that that I should be sympathetic to someone's desire to be consistent to their beliefs. But I actually don't have to do that.
Actively.
I know, but I don't have to do that. I don't have. In society, just imagine. So, which beliefs are we going to decide? See, the religion gets a special belief. I mean, I believe that I shouldn't have to wake up in the morning and go to work. That doesn't matter. You still have to wake up. I don't believe I should have to wait at stoplights. It's annoying. Why?
Well,
what?
are you
So
saying,
once again, but we do it not because it benefits us. We do it because it benefits the systemic value. So it's not that the waiting at the light is annoyance. It pisses me off, especially if it's yellow and I miss it and I have to wait a long time. But we don't do it and there's no one around, right? So why do we wait at the light? No one's around. Why wait? Even if there's no cop, we can't get busted. Why wait? We'll still probably do it, but we're doing it because of the systemic value that we know that this is just what's required. In other words, I do not believe that we have 100% rights. I tell this to anarchists all the time. There's no such thing. Unless you're going to go out in a boat in the middle of nowhere, because even if you go in, let's say, Alaska, you're still going to have to deal with, you can't just burn fires all you want. You just can't slaughter any animal you want. You still have to run in the system of things. So in a sense, you can't get outside that we share this earth communally. So once you do something private, I agree you should have, in a sense, 100% rights. But as long as it doesn't, and like you can't make bombs, it's going to, threaten your neighbors, or nuclear or something that's going to, it pollute, or so there is still limits. But to me, there's this thought that we have this right to 100% freedom. No, you don't. What you have a right is that
I'm not making the argument at all. I'm saying a wedding cake designer, where you're talking about an artist doing aesthetics here, and being asked to use their artistic.
So what's artistic? I'm a talker. That's my art. I draw. That's my art. So you do politics? Is that your art? So what? Once again, this is where you're assessing value. Who has a right?
Okay, let me go there. Let's go there. If
Yes.
I was to ask you and say, do you agree to give speeches on any topic that somebody wants you to give a speech on? First of all, you wouldn't agree to that. But let's say you did. Let's say that your thing was you're just you're essentially what do you call that? A mercenary. You're a mercenary you'll give a speech, you'll write a term paper on either side of the debate. You don't have any ground.
That's not me, but yeah, okay.
But imagine that. Imagine a scenario where I asked you that, and you knowing what you believe, and I said, now I'm going to pay you $100,000 to give a speech, and now, by the way, here's the topic of the speech, and you can fill in the blank on that, but you know where I'm going. So your expression is the ability to give a speech. Should you be compelled to accept my money if I'm willing?
Depending on what it is. I was a truck driver. That's an art. It's an art to be able to manage that vehicle. So
let me give you an example.
Can I refuse freight from a company that I don't agree with? See, because you're not talking about. So let's just say that what your arguments. Your arguments on art. I don't remember them saying they would do any gay cakes. So you're saying they won't do like a penis, let's say, because that's against their values. Yeah, but that's not what the issue is. They don't want to do gay weddings.
They don't want to do anything artistic is the only.
So in other words, if it is artistic, it's a scam. Because that's attaching a value to a lie. It is not about the art. They're not artists. They're not complaining about art. They're not saying they don't want to do a beautiful picture of two men's faces. They don't even want to put the wedding and say and know that it's for gays. If you think otherwise, then to me, you need to reassess their values.
I don't think otherwise. I think there's tremendous hypocrisy in a great deal that the right does. You and I agree on that. There's tremendous hypocrisy in a great deal of how they couch what they're doing. What I'm dealing with here is what happens for us to sabotage the progressive side of that equation by playing along and into their trap, by not going straight to where they're going to end up carving that narrative. So I'll give you an example. You would agree with me, I would think, that a great number of the people that are the most adamant about denying women their reproductive rights would not vote for a health care bill that keeps the baby alive after they're born. So they clearly don't give two craps about the life of the human even after birth, never mind at conception.
So and that's where we see their real value is not life.
But this is the thing. Here is a really important point to the whole idea of deliberative democracy, by the way. So the important thing is that we end up believing we are, in fact, all to varying degrees. Some of us way less so, and some of us more so. We all live in a trap of self-delusion. I guarantee you I can find self-delusion in any human being that you put in front of me. I will find self-delusion that goes along with the blinders, that goes along with, we build an edifice, or an intellectual edifice, we build a values framework for ourselves that makes the world cohere, that makes it hang together, and in the process, we almost invariably elevate ourselves as somehow being a little better than the average son of a bitch roaming the earth, because there is something natural about that elevating. There's something about our self-esteem journey. There's something about our wanting to affirm ourselves in self-care and self-love that has to precede other love. We can't love others if we actually despise ourselves.
I don't disagree that in the general sense of what you said there. But that doesn't have to do with the fact of what we're talking about. Because what I'm
saying is that there are a lot of people that are. Would you agree with me that the vast majority of people that subscribe to conservative evangelical theology in a passionate way have all sorts of blinders on that keep them from even looking at the reality on the ground? Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, of course. I think that we all do. I mean, I think there's atheists that have blinders about certain things because I feel like atheists don't.
Let's agree they have more of them. Let's agree that the things like the myth of climate change that are threatening civilization itself, that's some extremely important BS that they believe that's part of what their framework is. But when you sit where they are, when you actually can sit inside from a position of empathy, it gets back to the compassion piece here, when you can bring them in and understand from where we're sitting, we're saying this is a person that has been brainwashed into a warped view of reality.
I agree.
We are at the same time conferring political equality on them and knowing that they're operating out of this distortion. Knowing that they're operating less than the benevolent, wise philosopher king, we're saying you get the same one equal vote that I get, but now let's dialogue about this particular policy issue. When it gets to the issue of the LGBTQ, and I didn't mean to go down the rabbit hole of the actual debate. I wanted to steer away from any particular resolution because my point is to say, if we're going to let democracy resolve these issues, we need to understand what that means, because it's not as trivial as people may think to let democracy prevail. And even in a wiser version, we end up having to incorporate the worldviews of people whose worldviews we disdain, whichever side of that divide we're on.
And all I was saying is that, to me, it has to be for society. And society, to me, is not just a group of people. Because we don't call it gang in a sense, we wouldn't call it society in the form of what we're thinking about, humanity. To me, we need to think about humanity. So to me, the goal needs to be what we're doing, the use, how we're producing. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be involved. But I do not believe that a good, healthy society is, in a sense, ever going to be a bigoted one. It should not be one that is oppressive to people. That's not a good society.
Well,
so what I'm saying is,
so
1 second, I'm trying to say that. So I'm trying to relate this to democracy. So that what I'm saying is, even though I believe in direct democracy, I do not believe that if all of a sudden we decide, that there can't be, Muslims in America. Yeah, I'm not okay with that. Do you understand?
Right.
I don't care.
But there's no constitutional amendment yet.
But I don't care about. I'm talking about laws. I'm just saying, if the democracy, if we all decided, or not we, me personally, but if the majority of people became so fearful, let's say, of Islam, that it's just said that they want to make sure that all Islam, is kept out of America, and then anyone in here is either subjugated or is asked to leave. Because, in a sense, or executed. Because, in a sense, as a democracy, you could get to that place. So I'm not saying that I like democracy in that sense. That's a horrid thing.
Well, and that gets to a very interesting point here too, and obviously brings right into bear the fact of why you'll never get people inside the circle if you go direct. So that's a non-starter. We're not going to get to direct democracy as a practical, pragmatic.
Well, yeah,
matter.
I was saying I want that as much as possible. Yeah. So
well, let's actually say what
like,
can we do. So let's be very pragmatic and say what can we do by 2020? Because if you look at my article, I have a LinkedIn post. If anybody wants to go out, that says "Empowering a Wiser Democracy by Election Day 2020." I don't say Election Day in the title, but by 2020. And the whole idea is that by 2020 we could have 30 million #compassionate citizens that cover the entire spectrum of people debating both sides of that wedding cake, both sides of that Muslim ban, both sides of immigration issue of equal pay for women, Black Lives Matter, and carbon taxes, and universal health care, and any litany of things. You've got the full spectrum of political views that are on board with the hashtag, because we didn't say this means this policy. What we said was democracy is going to determine. Well, in the constraint equation for that is that we're not giving them democracy. What we're giving them is wiser representative democracy. We're giving them representatives that said they're going to be held accountable. That was their platform. Their platform wasn't carbon tax. It wasn't pro-life. It wasn't pro-choice. It was, I'm going to listen to the will of my constituencies, all of them, and inclusive, not left versus right, not just primary voters in the Republican or the Democratic side. What we have now is a two-party plutocracy where a tiny percentage of people that come out for the primaries dictates policy for 76% of us that don't find either platform to be congruous with our total set of beliefs.
Yeah, I'm not connected to the Democrats. I mean, I have Democrat friends, and certainly they're more on my side, so I'm more willing to vote if I feel so inclined, which I almost never do, but towards them or something like that, because I don't like stuff on the right. So, but I agree with you. I don't feel like.
Well, here's the thing on it. Again, getting back to I don't want to be a hypocrite here. I don't believe in democracy. Let me make it super clear. I spent the last 20 years of my life and made incredible sacrifices to get us to wiser democracy, but it's not because I believe in democracy. I actually don't. I think I'm with Winston Churchill. That's a horrible. Empowering the idiot that's a median voter in this country. Sorry for the offense taken by anybody who thinks they're on the median side, but I suspect that everybody who's listened to this point is not in the median voter. But the idiot that's the median voter in this country, it's almost idiotic for us to want to empower them. But it has to do with the pragmatics of empowering them, number one. And so let me get to this. It's extremely utilitarian for me that I say we are at a point in our culture where a majority of us would not impose a Muslim ban, where a majority of us would not assault and have bigoted public policy, would not be segregationist, would not allow Amish to impose and indoctrinate their kids into a religion without any pluralistic education that allows them
or any health care. There's some of them, they don't have, their teeth are falling out. Like, you know, to the well-being has to be, to me, number one. I mean,
well, but even on that, so it's so easy for us to agree at the highest level that we're trying to maximize the well-being of the worst off. I would contend that the vast, vast, vast majority of Bible-believing, that is, inerrant fundamentalist believers of the Bible, also believe in the idea of maximizing the well-being. Where we debate is what does it mean if eternal hell is at stake. And don't forget, they genuinely, passionately live their lives in accordance with that being the case. If eternal hell is at stake, the values that they're going to want to impose upon society are different than the values of somebody that doesn't believe in that eternal hell. We have to acknowledge that tension, because that tension is there.
Trust me. There. As an atheist that debates people on the street, in formal debate, online, trust me, I fully understand that.
Yeah, so we're acknowledging that by empowering a wiser democracy of the form that we're talking, which is a constitutional republic, not a democracy per se.
I know that. Democracy. I'm very aware of that.
And by the way, because you're talking about human rights, we absolutely need that Constitution to draw the boundaries as to what it means to discriminate. And the issue with
I prefer the United Nations a lot more than I prefer the Constitution. I understand that right now that's the only thing probably protecting us from some serious nonsense.
Yeah, so the United Nations, which is an incredible, ineffectual organization, because we're broken as a country. We're the most powerful nation on earth, economically still, militarily, and because our version of unbridled capitalism coupled with semi-theocratic tendencies in terms of the culture wars that are made possible, the reason that theocratic tendency is manifesting right now at the federal level, the reason that we have a quasi-theocracy in this country today is because 20 million out of 200 million people in this country, 10% of what I'm going to call the base, the people that watch CPAC, that actually thrive on CPAC and Breitbart and possibly Alex Jones, the people with the least perspective of a liberal, enlightened society dictated the terms of our anti-democracy. 20 million out of 200 million. So literally 10% of Americans that got 63 million total people to pull the lever, because those people had those 43 million extra people that showed up had more affinity as far as love and belonging, because they went to that church, for example. They didn't necessarily believe they're not marching with the anti-abortion clinic folks, but they identify with the group, and love and belonging, which is the lower level of Maslow, is where they're hung up on. They ended up voting for Trump on account of that wanting to belong.
Oh yeah, well, I think there's probably a lot of reasons why people voted. In fact, I know that a lot of people, if they follow me, probably know how much I absolutely despise Trump and all of his policies and thinking, including Pence too. I don't want to forget him, but yeah, I don't know that. So I know some of my friends are really harsh on the people that voted for him. I don't see them as like a uniformed thing. Like I know some of them, some people. Yeah, because I know some of my friends, I feel like that they're being too generalized. I'm not saying that there's not people that absolutely deserve their contempt that they're giving. I do believe that, but I think that they're giving that contempt too broad. Like. Let
me argue that 20 million of us on the left, 20 million of us on the left are just as bigoted in relation to how we treat those who pulled the lever for Trump as the 20 million on the right are bigoted in a general sense that we find particularly noxious. If there is an exclusionary aspect, and let me put it in concrete terms, that's 40 million people out of 200 million that would not support what I'm devoting my life to instituting, which is to say a wiser democracy. That's 20 million people that say, no, we want to give no voice. We want to make sure that those idiots on the right don't get a chance to interfere with our public policy, because we have a higher value. We're more spiritually evolved, if you're going to use that term, right? Yeah. We're more evolved, and therefore we should be able to dictate the terms. They're very exclusionary in that regard. It's asymmetric. There's a difference in the wisdom on the left and the right, but there is an exclusionary aspect to it that we can't reach. I have been railing for years, and I gave up. I literally gave up my own church, the Unitarian Universalist Church, the most liberal, progressive, organized, Christian-affiliated church on the planet, bar none. I have made zero progress in 15 years to get anybody there to endorse deliberative democracy. Now, that's a pretty low hit rate. That's a low hit rate. The thing I'm spending my life on, I have zero converts from my own church, because they are the ones that sit in that space of saying we are morally superior to the Trump supporter. And so, yes, we believe in democracy, sort of, but not really. And let's have a two-party system that allows us to silence the people we consider to be bigots. So I'm speaking from the center of the 76% that support VOP.org, by the way. If any of your audience is still around, VOP.org is the organization. It's a member of BridgeAlliance.us. It's a member of the Transpartisan Movement that has the Citizen Cabinet Initiative that gives you a mechanism, a metric for wiser democracy that you could recruit people to. And if you read my article on empowering a wiser democracy by 2020, you'll see it Run for America, which is runfor.us. Runfor.us is the people recruiting candidates that are transpartisan. VOP.org is the mechanism for holding them accountable, and they're absolutely inclusive. They're not excluding that Trump supporter. They're not excluding the bigot. They're not excluding the KKK guy. They're not excluding the ISIS supporter. They're saying if you are over here and you're an eligible voter and you registered to vote, you have a say, or at least you have a statistical probability of having a say, because this is about a random sample of people that cover all of the bases. Democracy is messy, it's nasty, and it involves a lot of views we consider heinous, because that's the nature of democracy. But if we're going to say we believe in democracy, we damn well better say it means inclusion.
Oh, I totally agree. But as far as letting them vote is a different issue. You said that I'm not morally superior. Bullshit. I am morally superior, but yes, you still have a right to vote. So I would just. But
they make that same claim, and we need to have them with their claim.
Well, I don't think the neo-Nazi is making a moral claim. They're just saying they don't have to. They don't have to exercise morality as a moral. I think what they're saying.
No, the argument for Nazism in Hitler's Germany, the deep argument. Don't forget, the vast majority of people in Germany were practicing Christians.
Oh yes,
a lot of Lutherans and a lot of Catholics.
Oh yes,
they were practicing Christians, and in and of itself, the axiological web of values and belief that they had was such that would have found what they ultimately did to be beyond morally reprehensible, except for the way in which Hitler, as a genius, as a propagandist genius, knew how to weave a narrative of cultural superiority.
No, he did that. Yeah.
Don't forget that when we invaded America, when we became as these immigrants that invaded and essentially exhibited genocide for centuries against the Native Americans.
Yes.
We did that in the name of Christianity.
Yeah, it's pretty freaking awful.
Superiority. So when you say to me that a KKK militant Christian and self-labeled Christian says that we want separation now, segregation now, and forever, as George Wallace did, that they see that as perfectly. Most of the KKK now don't believe in killing Jews and blacks. They believe in living in separate states and living in separate, totally segregated, where they just don't intermix, they don't intermarry. There's something about keeping that superior Aryan strain pure, where there's even a Slavic, an anti-Slavic, an anti-Mediterranean or Italic. There is a Germanic, there's real neo-Nazism in this country. The deeper roots are grounded in a theology of neo-Nazism. It is not. These are Christians. These are Reconstructionism. Go look at that word. That's stoning your disobedient children to death with the rules of the tribal elders there to guide you. It's some pretty sick stuff. So we could find that reprehensible.
Which
at the same time, you can't declare democracy. So, by the way, we're drawing the line on that. You don't get to vote. So
that's why I say. I mean, I agree that how we treat the least or the most vulnerable absolutely says what kind of a society. And that's the same thing why I feel like why I don't believe in the death penalty. Once that person is no longer an immediate threat, to then just murder them in a sense, to kill them, I just
right. But that order of belief, by the way, so the idea of being anti-death penalty, which the Vatican, by the way, is and has always been, they're also super pro-life, life begins at conception, and against birth control, but they've always been against the death penalty for exactly that reason. There is a deep Christian theological. It's one thing to beat up on Christianity. I left it for 40 years. I returned to it in a version that most Christians that are self-proclaimed would say, as I told you earlier before we started the official interview, most Christians would deem me to be going to hell. Most of them. Because my version of Christianity goes back to the red letters in the Bible. It says, here's what Jesus proclaimed as the most important thing, which boiled down to love your neighbor and love the least of these and love your enemy. The compassion was the permeating, undergirding theological foundation of what Jesus preached, who I consider to be a human being, and what he preached. And that has been bastardized, that has been ignored, that is anything but what he preached is what became organized patriarchal Christianity.
Well, yeah, in fact, I agree with that. I agree that I don't even think that Jesus was patriarchal. In fact, I know he told that, I think it was Mary, he told her that it's better to have listened than even to serve the food, because she was trying to correct the other chick. I can't remember now.
Right, absolutely. No, he was not. And in fact, the early church, for those who don't know this, before 325, before the Roman Empire hijacked the Christian church, the other church was as likely to have a woman leading the church group, and it was never in a separate church. It was always in homes. It was always in communities. There was no separate institutional aspect of Christianity. That was all refabricated and constructed after the fact to get the list of popes and all that. There was no pope. During that period, there was no central, this is the guy you submit to his theocratic or theological argument, his infallibility. That didn't even come in until the 1800s, infallibility for the pope. The early church was very much a communal, very much communism, by the way. If you have two shirts, your neighbor has none, give a shirt to them. It was very much otherworldly. It was very much about not being hung up on mammon and all the things of this earth. And it was very much like the Mennonites today. If you look at the Mennonite religion, the way they actually live their lives in community. The Amish have deviated somewhat, but the Mennonites are pretty pure to the original Christian church, and very few progressives would have a problem with the Mennonites because of how they treat. They would have a problem in the sense that they're maybe too faith oriented, but and there is an indoctrination aspect about Bible reading and whatnot, not exposing them to all what they consider to be outside the scope of that. But they're definitely, it's easy to have sympathy for the Mennonites because of living what Jesus preached. But that's a minority in the Christian world. The majority is ruled by organizations that were created by men, and for power.
Yeah, which is so interesting because I do a lot of stuff on research for my book on the I'm doing. It's called the Evolution of Religion: Removing the Rationale of Faith. And so to me, it's called the Tree of Lies and Its Hidden Roots. So to me, I looked at religion, and one of the most profound things that I found out is how much women were involved. I mean, it's like ridiculously how much. So totemism is almost an exclusive, and it begins, origin I see as about 50,000 years ago, almost exclusively women. They're all the figurines, the majority, not all, but the majority. There's also a lot of animals and stuff, but it's mainly, women and animals. But and a lot of these, to me, I think it is hunting magic. But it's so interesting how it was already that people consider those cavemen, because this is like the oldest one's like 42,000 or something years ago. So and it's a pendant they wore around their neck. So it wasn't like a child's toy or something. It was something that someone was using for a purpose and had a meaning. The iconography of it itself. It was already female. So there's a lot of iconography female. Then you see shamanism, right? At 30,000 years ago, up in Siberia, it's a female that they inter, they buried, whatever, and they put a bunch of ritualistic, shamanistic stuff with her. Then every shaman after that is female that they find. They don't find no male shamans. Way later, right? So it's female, because there's a female one in 14,000 in Israel. There's another one in Germany, or is it Bosnia, Czech Republic? Anyways, but there's another one. It's like another one in Germany is 9,000. There's another one I think over there. Like I said, Bosnia. I don't know. I can't remember exactly, but there's another one. I think that's like about 7,000, 8,000. But there's a whole bunch of them. And it's all female. And even if you look at the 12,000 years ago in southeast Turkey at Göbekli Tepe, tons of female imagery iconography. And to me, I see that as the origin actually of, in a sense, gods or goddesses. At that point, it's paganism about 12,000 years ago up there in southeast Turkey, and then it bleeds down from there into Mesopotamia and into Egypt. And it's still female down in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, their original god wasn't a god, it was a goddess. And she was self-created in the sense that she didn't have any partner and no male made her. That she was to them, and then she gave birth and created. There's not like that, and I'm not saying, so people are listening to know about Sumerian mythology, I'm not saying that there's only one origin or, creationism, whatever, myth. There's multiple, but the original one was female. So, and then also, Sumerian was not their original name. That's what the name that was given to them, by the Babylonians, or it was the Assyrians. Anyway, so the point is that it was female, right? So, if you look at Egypt before the dynastic period, before the first pharaoh, female. If you look at all the graves, so the graves of everybody, male and female, it was buried with a female goddess figurine, or presume it's a goddess. And so in a lot of the kings in Mesopotamia, when they the original ones started, a lot of them were actually given their authority, or is believed authority, from a female goddess, not a god. And it's just so funny. And the first like emperor or queen, whatever, ruler, I think it's Egypt, I think it was like 4,000 something, 700 or something years ago. And so there's tons of, up until about 2,000 years ago, women in a sense had a set of power. But 5,000 years ago is when, to me, really is when the hierarchy happens. Because once Egypt decides that you have to be a male to be a ruler, they just cut women right off there. And it's very interesting. Up in northeast Turkey, 4,000 years ago, they found it was a treaty between them and Mesopotamia. But basically, the treaty, it had a thing about that you have to respect the rights of women as equal. This is very important to me. It's the oldest, in a sense, women's right documents in the world. But this tells you the fact that you have to tell people they have rights means they're already being a threat. Because you wouldn't say it otherwise. It would be a given. So it just shows the problem of women's oppression, and goes way back.
Right. No, I agree. By the way, I have to make a little bit of a coffee dispensal break here for about 60 seconds or so.
We can
cover.
You can go. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if you wanted to cover some other stuff like you and I talked about that's kind of pertinent. As far as this goes, I mean, everything about deliberative democracy, the subtext is in fact re-empowering women. Just to get to the point of it, the subtext is the ending of patriarchy, but also the institution of a collective wisdom that comes not from re-elevating women over men, but to say that we are all equal, and so and that between us we have wisdom that's greater than any one of us together.
Right.
But because that can't be stressed enough, and that's the thing that, in general, because the conservative theological folks that take the Old Testament way too seriously, which is to say seriously at all in my view, but because they can justify the subordination of the women from that Old Testament theology. I agree with you completely that Jesus, as a radical, actually rejected that. Jesus, the early church was more likely to have, or as likely to have, women. So that your point being is that, yeah, that wasn't always the case, but ever since Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, Christianity has been overwhelmingly a patriarchal.
Oh, yes. Well, I was just trying to say is that the theme of religion, since I now have done a lot of research, I realize it was not always toxic towards females. That's a new thing.
Right. Well, that's why what we don't want to ever do is to say religion is bad. What we want to say is that there are unacceptable distortions of religion that do not lend themselves to building a peaceful world, that do not lend themselves to building a compassionate world. And things like the theology of an eternal hell, which gives you justification to do just about anything. If you want to justify beheading somebody, justify beheading the guy that's going to be a threat to the salvation eternally of your children and grandchildren, right? Because they're preaching apostasy or blasphemy. So the justification for all of the wars of religion that have happened where people have been killed because of what they believed is always traced to this notion of eternal hell. And that's something I consider just to be an evil notion. Again, they get to be in the pool, they get to be part of the democracy. And getting back to what I was saying, I would not have devoted the last 20 years of my life to democracy if it was the case that 51% of people thought that it was important to force people to convert to Christianity, it would have been a very different outcome. And there are countries in the Middle East where I would not advocate for democracy because over 50% of them think it's okay to execute you for blasphemy or apostasy. That's just a fact. That may not be something the progressives want to hear, but it's a fact that there's 13 nations, Muslim nations, that have the death penalty for apostasy and blasphemy. That is not conducive to peaceful world.
And
so I would not want
Saudi Arabia says I'm a terrorist because I'm an atheist.
Well, but we're right. there would be you certainly would be given a fatwa if you were out there mixing it up in the Muslim community. So this idea of Sharia law, we just did a meetup group. Our meetup group just had a meetup about Sharia law where we had a presenter presenting Sharia law. So it's not as though we're trying to stick our head in the sand here in the slightest. But, by the way, I did not get a satisfactory answer when I posed the question under the Q&A, an hour and a half of Q&A, as to how he navigated the fact that 13 Muslim nations took their version of Sharia law to mean execution, death penalty, for not believing the right way. Clearly, they dispelled that belief as American Muslims, but there was a fear, in my view, to actually proclaim publicly that those 13 Muslim nations got it wrong, because there'd be 13 fatwas, issued if they got it wrong. Well, that's precisely what's wrong with that religion.
I agree.
You brought that up. My first thought, by the way, was when you talk about having a justification, I don't mean sufficient justification, and I'm certainly not advocating for intolerance, but when you say there is some justification for making sure that we don't allow into this country people that believe things that are antithetical to democracy, that are antithetical to universal human dignity, I would argue that there is some justification for that. There's some now how he went about doing it, which is to proclaim everybody in the entire country and a ban on anybody from Iraq and so forth, is obviously patently absurd, bigoted, Islamophobic, and beyond. To say that there's justification for fearing some versions of Sharia law, and I don't say some versions, a great number of versions of Sharia law out there, you would have to be rather insane not to be somewhat fearful of that version ever taking root over here.
I am absolutely fearful of that. But I'm also fearful of the same, version that they have with Christians, because they
right. Of course, and it's not to pick on. So the Reconstructionists are just as heinous, in my view. Christian Reconstructionists are just as heinous as Saudi Arabian Sharia, the right to drown your disobedient daughter versus the right to stone your disobedient son to death. We're tweaking minor details here, right? Both of those are heinous.
I agree.
But there are people in this country that I have spoken to personally for hours on end, by the way, that belong to mainstream churches that believe that you should be stoned to death for masturbation. And that viewpoint we would find the vast majority of humans. That's why I'm not afraid of democracy in this country. I don't want democracy in even Egypt, never mind Syria or Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, in its current, because democracy to a bunch of brainwashed people that have bought into a warped version of Sharia law. And I say warped because if you go back to the text, if you go back to the Quran, there's more in the Quran per word. There's a bigger percentage of words that are for inclusion and against misogyny than there are in the Bible. The Bible is more misogynist as a per 100 words than the Quran. That's just a empirical fact.
I agree.
And so the Quran was a movement in the direction of equality for women, believe it or not, even though it exists.
Well, I don't know that I don't know. I agree with that statement, but you said that the Bible having more toxic stuff. Yes, that's true.
No, what I'm saying is that the Quran basically elevated. The Quran elevated Mary not as far as the Catholics elevated her, but much further than the Protestants elevated her.
Right,
You know, that big point of the Lutheran schism here. But they also had this whole notion of honoring the mother first and foremost, period. There was almost a matriarchal aspect to.
Yeah, no, I've read some of the Quran myself.
No, but there is a great deal of tolerating, and you can take any of the words that talk about what defines an enemy, which is an enemy of this theology, where they were actually uniting all of these warring factions in Saudi Arabia. You have to look at everything in cultural context. And when you look at the cultural context in which Mohammedanism or Islam arises, you realize that he was unbelievably enlightened in the context of where he was and what he was dealing with. And so, yeah, imperfect to be sure and flawed, but then what happens is you end up you go back to the same kind of tribalism ultimately because of the intervention of the West and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, all sorts of things. They are far less liberal and progressive now than they were in the Middle Ages. The Muslim world in the Middle Ages was very enlightened. It was intellectually advanced. They had the Enlightenment before we had the Enlightenment. They were culturally advanced way beyond Western Europe.
I know. What happened?
We ended up fouling up to the extreme. Talk about the Crusades and everything else that happened where the barbarians are the ones taking on, in the name of Christianity, taking on this great culture. It was actually a great culture. We pummeled that great culture into submission. We basically, by the time that the Ottoman Empire was ended in the early 19-teens, right around the time of World War I, when Ataturk ended up secularizing Turkey, and Turkey was, of course, the center of the Ottoman Empire. But when it got secularized, you still had all of the religionists, just like we have today. We have a secular country that is dominated by people who profess to be followers of Christ that follow on this entire spectrum. The thing I hope everybody that's in the atheist community understands is that the Christian world, the people that identify as Christians, are just as divided along the political spectrum of inclusion, exclusion, basically this idea of universal human dignity, as the secularists are. The secularists also divide out in terms of the Ayn Rand objectivists, the super capitalists, if you will, the ones that, if you look at the extreme, is a version of fascism. It's social Darwinism. It's survival of the fittest.
I don't like that shit at all.
The divide between those things has almost nothing to do with theology. Theology comes in after the fact almost as to what we subscribe to.
True.
We are genetically and or, how much of that feeds into the environmental, but we're genetically disposed to social Darwinism versus the communal, community affirming non-consumerism of the left. We've divided ourselves out and we've created theologies about progressivism versus conservatism outside of the God theology. We've created theologies that have to do with mapping those two things, and those theologies are both deeply flawed, and the point of and they're not equal. The theology of the Greens, of the progressives, is definitely more advanced. It takes in the Enlightenment. It doesn't deny science.
Yeah, I took a test. Speaking of the Greens, I took a test, and it says I'm something like 95% a Green Party.
Sure, yeah, and you would be. I mean, that because to me, to be aligned with the Green Party as opposed to the Democrats or the Republicans is to simply be wiser. I mean, just be very blunt and frank. If you agree with the direction that they're wanting to go, but the Green Party is fundamentally flawed by saying democracy itself is the anchor and then immediately disproving that by saying, here's the platform of things that we simply must have without regard to whether democracy gets you those things. And here's why that's sad and tragic. Because democracy would get you those things, and it would get you those things more expeditiously than you will get them in anything that's anti-democratic, like a two-party or a three-party system. You will actually get to
like I told you,
healthcare.
I'm totally, like I said, I'm totally for democracy. Hell yeah.
Real democracy. We don't have real democracy.
I told you, I want real democracy. Hell yes.
Yeah, but a version of it, the deliberative democracy by its very nature involves dialogue, deliberation, the conveying of information that relieves the blinders of the group doing the deliberating, and an expectation of empathic dialogue to be able to sit respectfully and listen to something that you may find morally repugnant is a very difficult thing to do, but the point of facilitated dialogue is to enable us to do that so that we can begin to see one another as human beings and separate the sin from the sinner, if you will. And I'm going to use that very Christian theological language, but to get some purchase from it. To separate the sin from the sinner from an atheist perspective is to say, look at the Trump supporter who went and did something sinful called pulling the lever for Trump. Sin in the sense of harming humanity, right?
Yes.
You did something, but you have to have deep compassion and genuine positive regard, and not only positive regard, but if you cannot elevate them to a position of moral worth that is equal to the moral worth of the person that didn't sin, that voted for the lesser of the evils, if you will, to put it in generalized terms, in voting for Hillary Clinton, because that was the only two viable choices, that Hillary was the better of those two choices. This is not a symmetric election
Which,
here.
you know, I actually, it had been 10 years or something since I had voted, but because it's not wanted to vote for Hillary, it's I hated Trump and what he stood for, and I felt like even as an anarchist, it is just my duty to try to do something to stop
Trump
this.
represented so much of what we would want to label evil if we're on the ideological left. We would want to say the Islamophobia, the anti-immigrant stance, the more than latent, quite overt racism and white supremacy, misogyny, a whole litany of things.
Nazism.
Well, yeah, I'm saying the all far extreme of white supremacy and everything else. All the stuff that was embedded in the values that ultimately he stood for in almost everything that he's done and has been about, as well as an elevation of and a continuation of white male and I've already used that terminology. I'll just use it. The world is in fact ruled by a comparative handful of white. They happen to be white. It's not about anti-white. I'm white. You're white. But white male billionaires are the ones that in fact control the shape and the systems in the global economy, and that is an empirically provable fact. That's not a speculative ideological statement. That's easy to point to the source of the decision making that happens to set up the globalization system that we have. This highly exploitive of people of color. It's highly exploitive of third and second world countries. It's meant to further enrich people that are already obscenely wealthy. And I mean obscenely wealthy because there's no moral justification for anybody having $1 billion, let alone $100 billion in the face of starvation on the planet.
I agree.
That's not about rewarding hard work. That there is no hard work that could possibly justify that amount of wealth. There's all sorts of very hard-working coal miners, never mind the evil, if you will, in coal mining, but there's a lot of hard-working coal mining that voted for Trump in support of white male plutocracy unwittingly. There's an incredible amount of deep ignorance that gets remediated in the context of facilitated deliberative democracy. So I'm not looking to transform people. The movement's not looking to transform people, except very incrementally. What we're looking to do... Well,
I'm looking to transform people.
What's that?
I said, I am looking to transform people. But through thought. I mean, I don't mean like force or coercion. I'm just saying
it is incremental. You would agree with me that how many times have you successfully converted a conservative evangelical from their theological conviction that Jesus died on the cross for them?
Well, not very often, but I have.
Well, you're way better than me to the extent that you've ever converted anybody. I am extremely ineffective converter.
Well, because you said that what I did is I was as an axiologist. What I did was a woman. I was at a convention and I have a nerve damage in my foot, so I sit down a lot. So I was sitting down and everybody kind of left, and then this person just sat down next to me, total stranger, and just starts talking to me, and she really liked me, and then she brought up that she's Christian and stuff, and I said I was an atheist, and then she was very interested. She never met an atheist, started talking to me. First off, she thought that I was a Satanist, and I'm like, no, I don't believe in anything that's not reality-based, science-based, provable. So I wouldn't believe in a ghost. I wouldn't believe in a god. I wouldn't believe in fairies. None of the above to me. So she understood. But then what I do is I always focus on the morals, like what it is to believe, why to believe, because I always feel it. When did you start believing? And when you say you believe, what is it you believe? How is it you believe? Because she goes, well, I've always believed. What does that mean? So you at what point as a child did you read enough information that you were compelled to believe? Well, no, I just was, my mom believed. So really what you did is you didn't ever believe. You just accepted. You were just told this is your religion, and you just said, okay.
You adopted a cultural
You adopted
a web of belief. And that, by the way, is true of a lot number of people. I wouldn't consider that a conversion. A conversion is somebody that's sitting there trying to convert you, who definitely believes.
No. But what I'm saying is, I was saying converted in the fact that once I showed her how she even got there, then I broke down that she had no reason to believe. She started realizing, wait a minute, I didn't ever, I don't think you just choose to believe. You either just, you just do it or you don't. But what I'm saying is, mentally, you can actually analyze a belief, or you can choose not to analyze it. Once you analyze it, if you analyze the belief and you find that it wasn't very valid. In other words, throughout the day, I could have an optical illusion or even a thought, like maybe I heard someone, or maybe your tone at first, I think, oh, this guy doesn't like me.
Right.
But that may not be accurate. So it's not an accuracy of the world, because I don't know if you like me or not.
Right.
But I can get an assumption, and that's where we can get errors. So an assumption, in a sense, is a belief. So when we analyze, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe my first opinion, like a lot of people have their first opinion of me, they hear anarchists, oh, this guy's a nutcase. They think. Or they hear, I'm an atheist, oh, that person must be sinful and hateful and, no morals. And then they talk to me and are like, wow, you got a lot of morals. And, you really care about people. You're not hateful. So then they don't understand. So and it's the same thing. I showed them that their perception, the belief was not warranted when you even first originated the belief. Once I'm not saying I could do that to everybody, but once I got her to see that, she stopped feeling compelled to believe it. And then she said, you know what? She was talking to me. She talked about 2 hours. She goes, you know what? I don't think I fully believe. I'm really going to start thinking about this stuff.
Right. Yeah, and that's always great, those moments of occasional, but people that are intellectually curious enough, and she was, to find out what it was to be an atheist, are automatically disposed to being able to tweak their webs of belief. But in general, just as a general rule, anybody who adamantly wears that fisher of men, the whole evangelical thing, anybody who is a serious Christian, by which I mean they consider it their duty to witness and to evangelize, converting them turns out to be incredibly difficult, because it's as difficult as getting somebody away from Scientology when you look at the Scientology cult. So this indoctrination into what I would consider a cult, which is most organized religion, that subscribes to very specific tenets, especially as regards eternal hell and substitutionary atonement, as a way to really divide yourself out. It's a very exclusive religion that says you're either going to hell or you're going to heaven with us because you believe what we believe. That's the kind of violence prompting that almost inevitably is going to lead to non-peace in some form there, because you can't abide somebody else that's carrying you down this wrong road any more than we could abide an ISIS group moving in and a community pledging allegiance to ISIS. We could not let them live freely in this country. We could not. There's just a point where you cannot tolerate a level of intolerance. And we're not talking about a guy not willing to do a wedding cake. We do need to rethink degrees and proportion here as to who we're excluding from America. You can't exclude somebody because they don't want to do a wedding cake for a gay because they think Leviticus is correct in their assertion. We can hope they change their mind. They may go to their graves. A lot of them go to their graves believing that homosexuality is a sin. And that's just to pick the one that's the hardest to convert people off of, because once they bought into that.
Oh yeah, it's definitely hard.
What's that?
I said, oh yeah, I'm not saying it's easy. It's definitely hard.
Well,
I just don't agree when people think it's impossible. It's not impossible.
Well, I've known actuaries, fellows in the Society of Actuaries I've known that believe that because they were Christians who happen to believe that that being gay was a sin, and were Rush Limbaugh fans and everything else, even though they're brilliant mathematically, but theologically they could not let go of this worldview that I do find absurd. I do find it absolutely unsupportable, and I find it unconducive to peace. But again, that person has to be in that conversation. We can't build a world that excludes that viewpoint, even though we want to say they're intolerant. They're not intolerant enough in a way that we can define. They're not a threat to humanity. They don't advocate beating gays to death. They don't advocate, they're saying that gays shouldn't have the right to marry because they think that's a sacred religious thing, which it isn't. I mean, it's a state thing, but that's a whole separate, and it's legal anyway, which is why I believe more in democracy today after it got made legal, because I don't have to worry about what the general sentiment is there. But I am, again, a pragmatic, democratic, passionate though I am, it's all pragmatics for me. Real wiser democracy gets us an expedited path to a triple bottom line economy that works for everybody, to a sustainable world that is going to maximize to the extent possible, maximize the well-being of the worst off. We collectively would not let 16,000 children die if, in fact, we have the power all by ourselves to make sure that doesn't happen. It's a cup of coffee a week for us if we collectively banded together and said, we don't want 16,000 kids dying. We would vote for that, notwithstanding the Ayn Rand objectivist that thinks you're violating their human rights because they think that their right to not be charitable trumps your right to not have those 16,000 kids die as a moral imperative. So we always have, there is no such thing as a public policy debate where we don't have somebody's rights pitted against somebody else's different conception of rights. So you can't even go with a foundation that says human rights is the problem, because we don't agree on what the human rights are.
As axiologists, I already know it starts in values. And that's what you have to define before you even get to their stuff. In other words, like to me, like in morality, I see it as axiology in a sense is first. And I already told you how I get to axiology. Axiology uses logic. Logic uses the actual arrangement of the world. And even if someone says logic can't be proved to be, 100% true because no absolute truth, well, I would say it's useful. And until we have a better thing than logic, if you have something better, please tell us and then show how it's more useful than logic. I'm more than willing, but until then, so I'm just saying how I get to axiology, because I'm trying to show for me how you can get a naturalistic worldview in a logical, rational way and come to how you can value things. So so I'm just saying logic, it helps axiology, and then my axiology then assesses the value of things, and then you can apply it to the world.
But when you get down, and there's a basic illogic to, because the illogic of Ayn Rand objectivism is where you catch them in the utter absurdity, is that they value their right to hold on to what they have, that they just declare as being not ill-gotten, right? That it was legitimate for Bezos to be worth $100 billion while people starve to death. Any logic that comes up with this, I get a right to hang on to that regardless of the suffering, and you can't tax me because I don't feel like being charitable, is to value your bank account over human life itself. So if I'm not valuing human life itself, why am I valuing your bank account, which is certainly subordinated to your life? You're wanting me to value not only your life, but your bank account, and you don't even want to value the human life that's over here as far as universal health care as an example.
Well, what they don't get, I guess they're not hearing their own words. If that was true, if we did what they said, the actual opposite would then happen. Because then that would mean that I can decide and you can decide together. All of us progressive in a sense or radicals could decide, you know what? So if we were in the majority, we're going to take away your rights, because to do that actually is to accept our rights, which you already said we have the right to do.
Right. Well, but you do get into all sorts of. But here's the thing. When I was at West Point, I discovered philosophy in 1979. I went there from 78 to 80 at the military academy. But the first philosophical paper I wrote, that's where I fell in love with philosophy immediately, was over the whole inability to derive an ought from an is. The idea that you can't go from any factual set to say from the facts that therefore, like on the death penalty debate, to say that human life has any intrinsic value is a value judgment. You can never separate that from the value judgment.
I'm an axiologist. I live in the value judgment.
Right, but once you say it's a value judgment, then it is absolutely conceivable to now start talking about the fact that different human beings have different ways of valuing the lines beyond which, we're not going to value human life anymore. There are all sorts of places where we draw lines as to what a human life is worth, and we put a price tag on it, indirectly or directly. And we put a different price tag on it, and we put a different price tag between this group and that group. People inside America, people in sub-Saharan Africa. And so in practical reality, we're always diminishing the value of human life less than infinity by a large margin.
But see, as an axiologist, I start with that understanding. Axiology is not an unrealistic. It's a normative in a sense. Like, to me, there's like two basic, just to help people understand. There's two basic types of philosophy: theoretical and normative. Normative I see as a youth philosophy. There's things that practical logic. I use it every day. It's not theoretical is an idea like that. It would be good. What's good? The concept of how we define good. That's not how you use every day. You operate in the world in a sense pragmatically all the time. And you may have never even thought about what good means. Or maybe if I asked you, you couldn't even define it. But yet you would still operate in the world as if you pragmatically understand what a sense of good is.
You know what you're valuing. You know the relative valuation that you place on different things, including deferred gratification versus just caving to your impulses of the moment. By the way, I never did get that coffee rid of. I do have to go and do that.
I really need to go too. So.
You know what? Yeah, 3.5 hours is probably more than anybody's listening to.
Yeah.
Once you post.
So, I think it's been for me personally. I want to appreciate and thank you. That for this conversation. And I also appreciate your time. And I want people to go to your and check out your stuff. Can you please tell the audience as we close all the stuff that you promote and where the links are?
Right. CompassionateCitizens.us will get you to everything else. It'll get you to the whole story, the mission. It'll get you. You can go to my LinkedIn profile. My name is going to be on the connection. I don't show up on Compassionate Citizens. We didn't get into this at all. I'm actually trying to disrupt the $60 billion a year residential brokerage industry to provide $1 billion or $2 of funding for marketing this movement. I'm actually trying to fix in a triple bottom line model that cares about people and planet to drive the funding engine to actually catalyze this movement.
Right on. And if anyone wants to know where to check out my stuff, I have YouTubes and I have videos. I have Instagram and all that, and I have a website and a blog, and I have Facebook and LinkedIn. Feel free to, if you can find me, to friend me. I'm open to anybody. And so,
Damien, I appreciate it very much. I do need to run there, but thank you so very much for the opportunity.
Yeah. And my everyone can find my stuff by Damien Marie AtHope, and it's just ATHOPE .com. My website has all my information. So I wanted to thank you all for listening. And